I'd been waiting for this trip for a long time. My job had been grinding me down day after day, same people, same problems, same screen. I felt like I hadn't really breathed in months. I needed to get out. Not a resort, not a city trip, something real. I wanted to camp somewhere far with no cell service, just me and the trees. I picked a forested area in northern Washington, somewhere near the Olympic Peninsula but more inland, away from all the popular trails. I found it from a blog that hadn't been updated in a few years. The writer mentioned a lake called Gray Pine Lake, and I had to dig through some hiking forums to even find coordinates. It wasn't on many maps. That made it perfect. I packed light but careful: tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, water filter, dried food, layers of clothes, bear spray, a knife, a compass, and 2 paper maps just in case. I also brought my headlamp, extra batteries, a fire starter kit, and a satellite GPS beacon. I wasn't dumb. Even if I wanted solitude, I made sure I had a way out if something went wrong. The drive from Seattle was long. The highway turned into winding mountain roads, then rougher dirt roads, then just a narrowing track through the woods. I parked my SUV on the shoulder where the trailhead used to be. There was a rotten post that might have held a sign years ago, but nothing now. I locked the car, slung on my pack, and started walking. The trail was faint. I had to look closely for bent grass and small cuts in the underbrush. It was clear no one had walked it in a long time. My boots crunched twigs, brushed ferns, and every now and then I'd stop to check my map and compass. There was a soft sound to the forest. No traffic, no voices, just birds, insects, the occasional gust shaking the tops of the trees. It took nearly 3 hours to get to the lake. I climbed a shallow ridge, pushed through some thick brush, and there it was, Gray Pine Lake. It was smaller than I expected, maybe the size of a couple football fields, but beautiful. The water was perfectly still, dark green with a silver shimmer near the edges. Old pines ringed the lake, tall and thin, their bark grayish and flaking like scales. The whole place felt like it had been forgotten. No trash, no fire pits, no trails around the shore. Just raw, untouched nature. I picked a flat spot near the water and set up my tent under a big pine. I laid out my sleeping bag, filtered some lake water into a bottle, and boiled it for tea. As the sun started to go down, the woods changed. Shadows stretched longer, and the colors drained from the trees. I got a small fire going with some dry twigs I found nearby. The heat felt good. The air was already dropping below 50 degrees. I ate a packet of freeze-dried pasta, watched the flames flicker, and felt a deep calm settle in me. No traffic noise, no emails, just wind and fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. When it got fully dark, I let the fire die and climbed into the tent. I zipped up the flap, took off my boots, and slid into the bag. The forest was alive with soft sounds. Leaves rustling, branches creaking, the ripple of the lake. I fell asleep quickly. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why. There wasn't a sound or light that snapped me out of sleep. I just opened my eyes. It was pitch black inside the tent. I reached for my headlamp and flicked it on, but I didn't unzip the tent right away. I lay there, breathing slow, listening. I didn't hear anything odd. Then there was a thud. Not close, not right outside, but far enough that I couldn't tell what it was. Just a single, solid thud like something heavy dropping onto the forest floor. I waited. A minute passed. Nothing. Then another thud, closer this time. Same dull weight to it like a log falling. But trees falling don't make 2 isolated sounds like that. I slid out of my bag slowly, still inside the tent, and sat upright. I turned off my headlamp. I didn't want to shine light into the forest. I sat there in total darkness, listening harder. The third sound wasn't a thud. It was a snap, sharp and quick. A twig underfoot. Now my brain started shifting. Could be an animal. A bear, maybe, or a deer. But deer are light-footed. Bears don't snap twigs like that. My fingers brushed the bear spray beside my sleeping bag. Then it got quiet again. Dead quiet. No wind, no owls, no insects. Just silence. I sat there for probably 20 minutes. Nothing else happened. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down. I didn't sleep well. When the light started to seep through the fabric of the tent, I got up. I stepped outside and looked around. Everything looked the same. No prints, no damage, nothing to explain the noises. I checked the surrounding area and didn't see any signs of animals. No torn branches, no scat, nothing. I told myself it was a deer, a big one, maybe stepping on fallen branches. The woods can play tricks on your ears. I boiled water for oatmeal, ate fast, and packed up my gear for a day hike. I planned to loop around the lake, then go inland to a ridge that looked promising on the topo map. I left the tent up but packed all the food and scented stuff into the bear bag and hung it from a branch. I carried my day pack, water, snacks, a knife, compass, and the GPS beacon. The trail was even fainter going inland. I had to bushwhack for a bit, but I eventually made it to the ridge. The view was amazing. You could see the whole lake, the trees around it, even the peaks further out. I stayed up there for about 2 hours, eating jerky and watching birds. Then I noticed something near the edge of the lake. A shape, not moving. From the distance, it was hard to tell what it was, but it hadn't been there that morning. Something pale and long near the shoreline where I hadn't gone before. I decided to check it out on my way back. It took a while to hike down, and I had to circle the lake clockwise to reach the spot. The closer I got, the more I realized the shape wasn't natural. It was plastic. It was a tarp, a greenish-gray one, half covered in leaves. And under it was a bundle. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't walk away either. I got closer, crouched down, and saw the edge of something under the tarp. Not gear, fabric, clothing. My stomach dropped. I backed away, stood there staring, trying to make sense of it. Then I saw the rope, a short length of frayed rope sticking out from under the tarp. I turned and left, fast. I walked back to my campsite with my heart hammering. Everything felt wrong now, like I wasn't alone out here, and maybe I hadn't been since I got here. I tore down the tent, shoved everything into my pack, and slung it on. I didn't stop to eat or rest. I just wanted to get back to the car. About a mile from the trailhead, I found something else. A small pile of stones, stacked carefully in the middle of the trail. They hadn't been there when I came in. They weren't just stones either. There was a strip of fabric tied around the top one. It looked like part of a shirt collar. I walked around it and kept going. I didn't run, but I was moving as fast as I could. When I reached the SUV, I almost cried. I unlocked it, threw my pack in, and got in the driver's seat. My hands were shaking. I started the engine, backed up, and got out of there. I didn't stop until I hit paved road. I didn't report it right away. I just drove home. I didn't sleep that night either. The image of that tarp, the rope, the stones on the trail, it all kept coming back. The next day, I called the local ranger station. I told them about the tarp, gave them the coordinates, and said I didn't touch anything. They asked a lot of questions. I answered what I could. 2 days later, they called me back. They found it. It was a campsite, old, probably from months ago. Under the tarp was a sleeping bag, torn clothes, and a rusted camping stove. No body, but signs someone had stayed there. They also found a journal. It was water damaged but legible. The rangers didn't say much, but from what they pieced together, the person had been living out there alone for weeks. The last entry in the journal was from late fall, talking about hearing voices in the woods and how someone had been circling their camp at night. They think the person either got lost or left in a hurry. No missing person reports matched the description. I didn't ask for more details. I didn't want them. That was 8 months ago. I haven't gone camping since. Not alone. Not even close to that place. I still go on day hikes sometimes, but I don't sleep in the woods anymore. I wanted to find peace and quiet. I wanted to get away. I did, but I found something else too. Something that reminded me that even in the real world, far from ghost stories or fairy tales, there are still things that hide in the trees. People, choices, consequences. And sometimes, what scares you isn't what's watching you. It's the fact that you might never know who was out there, or what they wanted. It was early June when I packed up my gear and drove out to a small, wooded area about 3 hours from where I lived in Oregon. I had taken some time off work and planned a solo camping trip to get away from the constant emails, phone calls, and daily pressure that had been building up for months. I wanted peace and quiet, and this place seemed perfect. It was a state-owned forest, not a major park, and not many people knew about it. No designated campsites, no paved trails, just a gravel road that eventually turned to dirt and disappeared into trees. I found the spot by browsing obscure hiking forums where someone had mentioned an old firewatch clearing that was now unused. It sounded remote, untouched, exactly what I wanted. The drive up was uneventful. I kept the windows down, letting in the warm air and smell of pine as the car wound up through the forest roads. I had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, bear spray, plenty of food, a first aid kit, flashlight, and a battery pack for my phone, which I planned to keep off. I parked the car on the side of the dirt road once the path became too narrow and overgrown. From there, I hiked for nearly an hour, cutting through a narrow trail thick with brush and moss-covered rocks. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional bird call. Eventually, I reached the clearing. It was maybe half the size of a football field, ringed by tall firs and cedar. There were no signs of recent activity, no fire pits or trash. It felt like I had the whole world to myself. The ground was soft with pine needles, and I picked a flat patch near the tree-line to set up my tent. The air was warm but not hot, and a breeze carried the scent of sap and damp earth. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, setting up everything with care. I didn't want to rush anything. I wanted to savor being away. That first night was quiet. I sat outside my tent as the sky dimmed, eating jerky and trail mix while watching the stars come out. It was so dark without any nearby towns or campsites that I could see more stars than I ever had back home. I didn't make a fire. I didn't feel like I needed one. I just wanted to sit there, surrounded by silence and the occasional rustle in the woods. I went to sleep early, sometime before 10, and for once, I didn't wake up once in the night. No cars, no phones, no people, just darkness and quiet. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds. The air was cool, and my tent had a slight layer of dew on it. I unzipped it and stepped outside, stretching and taking in the scent of pine and wet dirt. I made coffee with my small portable stove and ate some granola. After that, I hiked a little further into the forest, just exploring. The terrain was rough in places, thick with brush, and I had to use my hands to push branches aside. I saw no other people, no signs of life besides deer tracks and squirrels darting through the undergrowth. I liked it that way. In the afternoon, I returned to camp and rested. I journaled a bit, drank water, and lay back on a foam pad watching the sky. Everything felt calm. Too calm, maybe. There was a kind of stillness that I hadn't noticed the day before. No wind, fewer birds, but I didn't think much of it. Forests had their rhythms, and I chalked it up to that. That night, I felt a little off as I prepared to sleep. I kept thinking about how far I was from anyone. No service, no signal. If something happened, I'd be completely on my own. But that was part of the point. I shook off the unease, double-checked that my bear spray was next to my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and tried to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. It was pitch black, the kind of black where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I stayed still, trying to hear anything over the silence. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. Not far. Not a little twig under a squirrel, but something thicker. Something with weight. My heart started beating faster. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. But then I heard another snap, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footfalls on dry needles. I sat up slowly, holding my breath. My hand found the bear spray and gripped it tightly. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move more than I had to. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone trying to be quiet but not quiet enough. Then they stopped. I waited. Nothing. I don't know how long I sat there. Frozen. Felt like an hour. Eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, morning light was creeping through the tent fabric. I quickly unzipped it and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. No tracks. No broken branches that I could see. Maybe it had been an animal after all. I tried to convince myself of that. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I packed my bag that morning and hiked further out, telling myself I just needed to get my mind off things. I followed a dry creek bed that wound through a ravine and up the side of a hill. The forest was dense, and I had to watch my footing. Halfway up the ridge, I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a tree about 20 feet tall, and tied to it with what looked like faded nylon rope was a bundle of sticks. It was shaped like a crude figure, arms, legs, a head. Not something that fell that way naturally. It was old, weathered. Moss clung to the twine holding it together. But someone had put it there. For what reason, I couldn't guess. I stood there staring at it for a long time. Then I turned around and went back to camp. I didn't hike anymore that day. I sat by the tent with my bear spray within reach, jumping at every sound. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every little noise outside sent my heart racing. I didn't hear footsteps again, but I couldn't relax. By morning, I made up my mind to leave. The peace I'd come for had turned into a crawling paranoia. I packed up everything quickly, looking over my shoulder constantly. The hike back to the car was long, and I kept imagining someone following just out of sight. Every time I stopped to listen, the forest was dead quiet. When I finally reached the car, I tossed my gear into the back seat and locked the doors immediately. I sat behind the wheel, breathing heavily. I started the car, turned it around carefully on the narrow dirt road, and drove off without looking back. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a while. Part of me felt stupid. Nothing actually happened to me, technically, but I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen. A week later, I went online to those hiking forums, curious if anyone else had mentioned that area. I found a thread from 3 years ago, someone describing the same clearing, the same tree figure, the same feeling of being watched. But the thread had no replies, and the user hadn't posted anything else since. I don't camp alone anymore, not because I'm scared of animals or getting lost. I can handle those things. What I can't handle is not knowing if someone is out there, watching, waiting, for reasons I'll never understand. That kind of silence doesn't feel peaceful anymore. Feels wrong. And the worst part is, I still don't know if I was actually in danger, or if it was all in my head. But when I think about those footsteps, the careful way they approached, the figure in the tree, when I think about how still everything was, I know I made the right choice getting out of there. Sometimes, being alone isn't peaceful. Sometimes, it's exactly what someone else wants. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip up in the northern Cascades of Washington. The summer crowds were gone, and the air had started to cool off just enough to make the nights crisp but not unbearable. I had some vacation time saved up and wanted to use it before the cold really set in. I picked a spot I'd never been to before, about 5 hours from Seattle, near a lesser-known trailhead called Weller Ridge. From what I read, it wasn't particularly popular, which was perfect for me. I wanted the quiet, the isolation, the chance to disconnect from everything for a while. I drove up in my old 4Runner, the back packed with my usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, stove, freeze-dried meals, headlamp, extra batteries, water filter, and enough clothes to layer up if the weather changed. I brought a small hatchet for firewood and my fixed blade knife I kept sheathed on my belt anytime I was out in the woods. I also had a GPS, a laminated map of the area, and my compass. I've been camping alone for years. I was cautious, methodical. I wasn't one of those guys who wandered off into the wilderness with a granola bar and a phone. I planned, double-checked, and kept backup options. The drive up was smooth. I stopped at a gas station an hour from the trailhead, filled up, grabbed a coffee, and sent a quick message to my brother letting him know my plan. 3 nights at Weller Ridge, no cell service expected, back by Sunday night. I even gave him GPS coordinates just in case. It was something I always did, just a precaution. He never made a big deal out of it, but he appreciated that I stayed predictable. I arrived at the trailhead in the early afternoon. My plan was to hike about 6 miles in, where there was a small clearing near a creek I'd read about in an old trail report. The trail was rugged, narrow, and overgrown in places. Fallen branches and loose rock kept me alert. There was no one else parked at the trailhead, which didn't surprise me. It was late in the season, and the area wasn't well traveled. As I hiked, I kept a steady pace, stopping every so often to drink water and check my map. The woods were thick and quiet, not eerie, just undisturbed. The deeper I went, the more the trail disappeared. By the time I hit the 5th mile, I was mostly bushwhacking, using my compass to stay on course. I found the creek eventually, exactly where it was supposed to be. It cut through a shallow valley with just enough flat space on the east side to pitch a tent. I set up camp just before dusk. The tent went up easily, and I gathered some dry branches for a fire. I cooked a bag of chicken and rice over my small stove and ate with my back against a tree, listening to the sound of the creek and the wind moving through the tall pines. That first night was uneventful, cold, but peaceful. I stayed up late watching the fire burn down to glowing embers, then crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep with the sound of running water in the background. The next morning, I woke up just after sunrise. My breath hung in the air. I boiled some water for coffee, stretched out my legs, and decided to explore up the ridge behind camp. I followed the creek upstream for a while, climbing over mossy rocks and ducking under low branches. I marked my path with strips of orange tape just in case. About a mile up, I found what looked like an old game trail that led higher into the woods. The terrain was rough, lots of loose dirt and roots, but it gave me a good view of the valley below. Around midday, I headed back. As I came down, I noticed something strange just off to the left of the trail. It looked like a pile of stones, stacked deliberately. 5 or 6 flat rocks balanced on each other in a way that didn't seem accidental. Caught me off guard. I'd seen cairns before, usually near trails or summits, but this one was deep in the woods, in the middle of nowhere. I walked over to it and crouched down. The rocks were dusty, some with lichen on them, but they didn't look old. A few still had clean edges like they'd been moved recently. I didn't touch them. I stood there for a while, just looking, trying to decide if it meant anything. Eventually, I turned back to camp. That night, I couldn't get the image of the stacked stones out of my head. It wasn't fear exactly, just a sense of something being off, like I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. I stayed up later than usual, watching the fire, scanning the trees beyond the glow of the flames. I didn't see or hear anything unusual. No animals, no movement, just the occasional rustle of wind. I slept, but lightly. Every sound outside made me open my eyes. At one point, I thought I heard a faint snap, like a twig breaking underfoot, but it could have been anything. A raccoon, a deer, maybe even a pine cone falling. I told myself not to overthink it. The wilderness was full of noises, most of them harmless. I eventually drifted off again. The third day, I decided to hike out in a different direction. I didn't want to pass the rock stack again. Something about it bothered me, so I crossed the creek and followed the opposite ridge, using my compass to keep track. The forest was thicker on this side. Shadows stretched long even in the morning. I found more signs of animals. Tracks in the mud, droppings, some scratches on a tree that looked like they'd come from a bear. I kept moving slowly, scanning the ground and the trees. Then I found something else. A tarp partially buried under a layer of leaves and dirt. It was dark green, dirty, torn in one corner. At first I thought it had just been left by a careless camper, but as I cleared more debris, I saw a rusted zipper along one edge. It was part of an old tent. The rest had collapsed or been scavenged. I found the frame poles scattered nearby, some bent. There was also a half-melted plastic spoon and the remains of a boot sole. It looked abandoned and not recently, but still, someone had been here and clearly hadn't packed up properly. I felt uneasy again. This wasn't on any report or map I'd seen. No mention of an old site, no warnings. I moved on quickly, not wanting to stay near it. I made my way back to camp just before dark. Everything was as I'd left it. My tent was zipped up, my gear untouched. That night, it got colder. The temperature dropped below freezing, and I had to add an extra layer just to stay warm in my sleeping bag. I started the fire earlier than usual and kept it going well into the night. Around midnight, I heard something again, closer this time. Another snap, a crack, Then silence. I turned off my headlamp and sat still, listening. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I stared into the trees. Then I saw something. Not an animal. A shape, human, standing between two trees about 30 feet away. It wasn't moving, just standing there. I froze. My first thought was that it had to be another hiker, maybe someone who'd gotten lost. But no one would be out here this late, this deep without light. And they weren't calling out, waving, or doing anything to get help. They were just standing there, staring. I reached slowly for my flashlight, clicked it on, and shined it toward the trees. But the shape was gone. The beam cut through the branches and lit up empty trunks. I stood up, heart racing, scanning the area. I couldn't see anyone. I circled the fire a few times, listening for footsteps or voices. Nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the fire burning until dawn. I packed up as soon as the sun came up. I moved quickly, stuffing gear into my pack, not bothering with breakfast. I kept checking over my shoulder, waiting to see that figure again, but there was nothing. The woods were quiet. The hike out was grueling. My legs were sore, and my head throbbed from lack of sleep. I stayed alert, checking the trail constantly, making sure I was still on course. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I heard another noise, branches breaking behind me. I stopped, turned, and waited. This time I called out loud, not for help, just a warning, letting whoever or whatever was out there know I was aware. I didn't get a response, but the noise stopped. I reached the parking lot by late afternoon. My 4Runner was still there. Nothing looked tampered with. I got inside, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time before starting the engine. I drove back in silence. No music, no podcasts, just the road and my thoughts. When I got home, I told my brother I was back safe, but I didn't mention the figure in the woods or the abandoned tent. I didn't really know what to say. It didn't make sense. I wasn't even sure if what I saw was real or a trick of the light, a combination of cold, fatigue, and stress playing tricks on my mind. But then a week later, I was cleaning out my backpack and found one of the orange trail markers I'd used. It had been folded and tied into a tight knot. I never did that. I always left them hanging loose so I could find my way back. And I know I didn't miss one. I counted every single one as I packed up. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike. I still get out into the woods, but never that deep and never without a group. I still don't know what I saw that night or who it was, but I know for sure I wasn't alone out there, and I'm not interested in going back to find out who. It was late August when I decided to go camping alone in northern Idaho. I was 34 at the time, in decent shape, had experience with backpacking, and needed a break from work and the constant noise of the city. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just marked my destination on a printed map I left on the kitchen table in case anyone came looking. I figured I'd be out for 3 nights, just me and the woods. It wasn't about escaping life exactly, more like hitting pause on it. I picked a location I'd never visited before, off a Forest Service road near Priest Lake. The area was surrounded by thick pine forest with minimal foot traffic. No official campgrounds, just dispersed camping spots. I'd found the place on a forum where hunters talked about quiet areas with good game. That was fine by me. I wasn't hunting, just wanted the kind of quiet only a place like that could offer. I planned to hike out about 6 miles from the road, pitch camp near a small creek I saw on the map, and then spend the time fishing, maybe doing some journaling and just clearing my head. The first day went exactly as planned. I parked my truck at a pullout around noon, loaded my pack, and started walking. The trail was barely marked, mostly just an overgrown path made by animals or the occasional hiker. It was warm, maybe mid-70s, but not too humid. I made steady progress and enjoyed the silence broken only by the sound of my boots crunching leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. After a few hours of walking, I reached the creek. It was just as I imagined, clear, cool, and surrounded by a small clearing. The water had that cold, clean smell that only mountain creeks have. I set up camp a few feet from the water, nestled between 2 thick trees for some shade. The tent went up fast. I gathered firewood, filtered water, and cooked a simple meal over my portable stove. The sun started to dip behind the trees around 8, casting long shadows across the clearing. I sat by the fire until the stars came out, then crawled into my sleeping bag. I left the rain fly off to let in the cool breeze and look up at the sky. It was dead quiet. No airplanes, no cars, no human voices. Just the sound of crickets and the occasional splash from the creek. Felt good. I woke up once during the night to pee. When I stepped outside the tent, I saw something moving near the edge of the trees. A deer or maybe an elk, based on the size. I couldn't see clearly in the dark, but it moved smoothly and didn't seem alarmed. I got back in the tent and slept fine after that. The next day, I spent most of my time exploring upstream, fishing a bit, and just enjoying the quiet. The fish weren't biting much, but I didn't mind. I brought enough food anyway. In the afternoon, I found what looked like a trail leading further up into the woods. It was faint, but looked like it had been used before. Probably by animals, but I couldn't be sure. Something about it made me uneasy, so I didn't go too far, just marked the spot in my mind and turned back. That night, things changed. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place at first. It was soft, like something brushing lightly against fabric. I froze in my sleeping bag and listened. The sound came again, something scraping gently against the outside of my tent. Not wind, not a branch swaying. It was deliberate and low. I stayed still, breathing as quietly as I could. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. I didn't hear any footsteps, no rustling of leaves or breaking twigs, just complete silence again. I lay there for a long time, barely blinking, before eventually convincing myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a raccoon or something curious about the smell of food, even though I'd hung my bear bag properly away from the tent. Still, I didn't get much sleep after that. Every little sound made me sit up, straining to hear more. In the morning, I stepped out and checked the area. There were no clear tracks, just disturbed pine needles and some faint marks near the side of the tent. Could have been anything. I tried not to overthink it, made breakfast, and decided to go for a longer hike to clear my head. I followed the creek for a mile, then looped back around through the trees. The day was warm again, and by the time I returned to camp, the tension from the night had mostly worn off. But that feeling, that quiet itch of being watched, came back just as the sun started to set. It wasn't anything obvious, just a heaviness in the air. I started to notice how the birds had gone quiet earlier than the night before, how the trees seemed darker somehow, the spaces between them deeper. I made a fire and kept it going longer that night, even after I crawled into my tent. The flames made shadows dance on the fabric, and every time the fire popped, I jumped a little. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. This time it was louder, clear footsteps. Not animal-like, human, slow and steady. The sound of weight pressing down on leaves and snapping twigs. They came from the same direction as the faint trail I'd seen earlier. I sat up in my tent, heart hammering, unsure what to do. I didn't have a gun, just a small hatchet and a knife. My bear spray was near the zipper just in case. The footsteps stopped just outside the clearing. I held my breath. Minutes passed, then nothing. No retreating steps, no movement, just stillness. Eventually I heard something else, something metallic. A soft clinking sound, like metal brushing against metal. It was distant but clear in the still night. I couldn't make sense of it. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the hatchet, barely breathing. As soon as the sun rose, I stepped out of the tent, looking around. Still no clear tracks, no sign of anyone, but the feeling was stronger than ever now. Something wasn't right. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to believe it. Maybe I was just on edge from being alone too long. Maybe it was just a hunter passing through in the night. But the way they stopped right outside the clearing and then just disappeared didn't sit right. That day, I didn't stray far from camp. I kept my bear spray on me the whole time. I didn't build a fire that night, just ate a cold meal and tried to stay alert. The night was colder without the fire, but I didn't want to give away my position. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps again. Same pace, same direction, This time they didn't stop outside the clearing. They entered it. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear them circling the tent. Slow, deliberate steps. The soft clinking sound again, closer now. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I gripped the hatchet with both hands, ready for something, anything to happen. Then I heard breathing. Not mine, just outside the tent. Low, steady breathing, like someone was crouched right next to me, trying to listen. I stayed frozen, not daring to make a sound. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away, slowly. Then they were gone. I waited until dawn before moving. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, barely eating anything. Every few minutes I stopped and listened. The woods felt wrong, like they were holding their breath. I hiked out without resting, pushing hard through the underbrush. The path seemed longer on the way back, more tangled. I was exhausted, but I kept moving. When I finally reached my truck, I was shaking. The tires were fine. No sign of tampering. I climbed in, locked the doors, and drove without stopping until I reached cell service and then kept going until I was back home. I didn't go to the police. I didn't know what I would even tell them. There was no crime, no evidence, just fear. But I couldn't stop thinking about that breathing. The way it was calm, intentional, close. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the area online, digging deeper into forums and old posts. I found a few threads that had been deleted, but one cache showed someone warning others not to camp near that creek. No explanation, just a simple warning: don't go there alone. I haven't gone camping since, at least not alone. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that breathing again, measured, quiet, patient, not like someone who was lost or scared. It was the breathing of someone who was exactly where they wanted to be, and that someone was standing just inches from me. Whoever it was never hurt me. They didn't take anything. They didn't speak. But I think they were trying to decide something, watching me, waiting. Maybe they just liked knowing I knew they were there, that I couldn't stop them, that I had no control. The scariest part wasn't the footsteps or the breathing. It was the fact that I'll never know who it was or what they wanted, and if they're still out there doing the same thing to someone else right now. But the moment I drove away, I knew this much: I got lucky. I didn't make it out because I was smart or prepared. I made it out because whoever was out there let me go. And that thought still keeps me awake sometimes. The sun had barely set when I reached the camping site. The air was thick with the earthy smell of pine and fresh soil, the kind of scent that reminded me of quiet, peaceful times. It was a perfect spot, secluded, away from other campers, hidden deep in the woods. No one would disturb me. That was the whole point of coming here, to get away, to unplug and let my mind rest. I had chosen this site after searching for hours online. It was a bit off the beaten path, not a place many people knew about. The reviews had been mixed, but most said it was beautiful, peaceful, and safe. The trail leading to the site wasn't too difficult, just a steady climb up, but it was the kind of hike that would wear you out by the end of the day. I was fine with that. I liked the idea of being alone in the forest, disconnected from the chaos of everyday life. The first step was always to set up camp, and I knew what I was doing. The tent was easy to pitch, and I quickly gathered some firewood. I packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, and enough food to last the night. No need for anything fancy, just the basics. The night air was cool but comfortable, and there was a slight breeze that made the leaves rustle gently above me. I loved that sound. It made me feel at ease, connected to nature. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the woods around me seemed to grow darker. I didn't mind that either. I had a small campfire going, and the flames cast flickering shadows on the trees around me. There was something calming about the crackle of the fire, the way it pushed back the darkness just enough to keep it at bay. As the firelight danced across the ground, I felt a deep sense of peace. It was the kind of moment that made you appreciate the simplicity of life, the stillness that came with being alone in nature. I didn't think much of it when I heard the rustling at first. It was just the wind or maybe an animal, something small, probably a squirrel or a rabbit moving around in the underbrush. The woods were full of life, but most of it was shy, only venturing out in the quiet of night. I didn't mind. In fact, I welcomed it. The idea of animals moving around, living their lives just out of sight, added to the charm of the place. But as the night wore on, the rustling got louder. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was probably a deer or something bigger moving around. I was alone, after all, and there was no reason to be paranoid. Still, the sound kept coming closer this time, then farther away, then back again. It wasn't the random, occasional sound of small animals. It was rhythmic, deliberate almost, as if something was circling my camp. I stood up from my campfire, trying to peer into the darkness. I couldn't see anything. The trees loomed in the distance, their shapes only partially visible in the dim light of the fire. The rustling continued, now unmistakably coming from the brush near the edge of the clearing. It was so faint, almost like breathing. I froze, straining my ears, trying to pick out any specific sounds. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No footsteps, no branches breaking, just the rustling. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease that crept up my spine. It was probably just an animal. It had to be. I went back to my fire, hoping the sound would go away. But it didn't. It was constant, and it made my skin crawl. It was as if the creature, or whatever it was waiting. Waiting for what I couldn't say, but it wasn't right. I added a few more logs to the fire, watching as the flames flared up. The heat from the fire felt good against my skin, but it did little to ease the knot of tension in my stomach. The rustling stopped for a while, and I thought maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was all in my head. I'd been out here for hours, and the isolation was starting to get to me. It was easy to let my mind wander, to start thinking about things that didn't make sense. But then I heard it again, closer this time, definitely closer. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound wasn't subtle anymore. It was heavy, like something big moving through the brush. My eyes darted around, trying to catch any movement in the darkness. But there was nothing, only the trees and the shadows, stretching long and thin in the firelight. A cold shiver ran down my spine. It was instinct, a primal warning telling me to be aware, to be alert. My senses were sharp, but it felt like something was lurking just beyond the fire's reach. I grabbed a stick from the fire and held it in front of me like a makeshift weapon. Ridiculous, I know, but it made me feel a little safer, even though I wasn't sure what I was expecting to fight off. I circled the campfire, slowly, scanning the trees, the shadows, the edges of the clearing. Nothing. I felt foolish, standing there with a burning stick, looking for an animal that wasn't there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there, moving in the dark, just out of my sight. The night pressed in on me, the silence growing thicker, more oppressive. And then, just as I was about to dismiss it all as nothing, I heard it again. A soft thud, a heavy step followed by another. This time, it wasn't coming from the brush. It was coming from behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Only the trees, the dark forest stretching endlessly around me. I felt my breath quicken. I knew I couldn't be imagining this. Something was definitely there. But what? And how close was it? I backed up to the fire, clutching the stick in my hand, my eyes darting around frantically. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There was no one else out here. No one else could have found this spot, not this quickly. I'd hiked in alone, and the trail was barely a path. There was no way anyone else would be out here without me hearing them long before now. And yet, the steps kept coming. Soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakably there. I kept my eyes on the trees, watching for any movement. The firelight flickered, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The rustling was growing louder now, not from the brush, but from somewhere deep in the woods, just out of sight. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. I didn't know what to do. I had no phone, no way of calling for help. I couldn't leave now, not with whatever was out there so close. I needed to stay by the fire to keep it going, but the thought of staying in one spot exposed terrified me. I had to make a decision. I grabbed my things, my sleeping bag, the few bits of food I'd packed, and stuffed them into my backpack. I was ready to leave, but something stopped me. A voice in my head, the voice of reason, told me to wait, to stay calm, couldn't just leave. If I ran, I might make myself an easy target, and I had no idea who or what was out there. Instead, I decided to stay put, to try and outlast whatever this was. The fire had to stay strong, couldn't let it die. I fed the flames, watching them grow higher and higher, throwing off warmth into the night. The rustling was relentless now, all around me, like something was circling the camp. But still, I couldn't see anything. Minutes passed, then hours. I was wide awake now, every nerve in my body on high alert. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me to make the wrong move. I thought about the hike back, the long trail that led out of the woods. It was too far to go on foot in the dark, especially with the growing fear that gripped me. If I left now, I might not make it out alive. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the sounds stopped. The rustling, the footsteps. It all faded into the night. For a brief moment, I was left in complete silence. The fire crackled, and the wind whispered through the trees. But there were no more sounds. Nothing. I waited for a long time before I dared to move. Slowly, I lowered the stick, my breathing finally returning to normal. I glanced around the camp again. Still nothing. The forest was quiet now, unnervingly so. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, constantly checking my surroundings, waiting for the sounds to return. But they never did. By morning, everything seemed normal again. The camp was still and quiet, the sun rising in the east, casting a warm glow over the woods. The air was fresh, and I could hear the birds starting their morning songs. I packed up my things and made the long hike back to my car, never once looking back. The feeling of being watched lingered for days, even after I returned home. But I never went camping there again. I had never been on a solo camping trip before, but something about the idea felt right. I wanted to disconnect, get away from the noise of daily life. It was mid-October when I decided to pack my things and head out to a remote spot in the woods. The weather was still warm enough for a late-season camping trip, but the air was crisp enough to remind me that winter was just around the corner. I was alone. No friends, no family. Just me and nature, or so I thought. I chose a spot that looked perfect on the map, deep into the forest, far from any trails or campgrounds. It was quiet, peaceful, and seemed like the ideal place to clear my head. I didn't need anyone else. I had all the equipment I needed. A small tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and enough water for a couple of days. I also packed a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a small portable stove for cooking. The forest was deep, quiet, and felt endless. The kind of place where silence stretches for miles, and everything feels so untouched. The drive out to the campsite was long, but I didn't mind. I liked the feeling of being out in the wilderness, disconnected from the modern world. The roads were empty, winding their way through stretches of trees that seemed to reach endlessly toward the sky. The deeper I went, the more isolated everything became. Eventually, I reached the small dirt road that led to the trailhead. I parked my car, grabbed my pack, and set off into the woods. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting a golden glow over everything. I had arrived later than I planned, but the hike-in wasn't long. I kept my pace steady, moving carefully to avoid tripping on the uneven ground. The forest felt dense, and every step seemed to bring me further into a world untouched by time. The air was thick with the smell of pine and earth, and the sound of leaves crunching beneath my boots echoed in the stillness. I reached the site I had marked on my map and set up camp quickly. The tent was easy enough to pitch, and within the hour, I had a fire going. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of the flames. The sun had set completely now, and the only light came from the fire and the pale glow of the moon. There was something calming about it. I knew I had made the right choice coming here. I could hear the occasional rustle of animals in the distance, but it didn't bother me. The woods were alive and I was part of it. As the night deepened, the air grew cooler. I added another log to the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. I roasted some marshmallows and made a small meal, enjoying the quiet solitude. The sounds of the forest seemed far away, muffled by the crackling fire. It was peaceful, too peaceful. I tried to push away the feeling that something was off, but it lingered in the back of my mind. Later, when I was settling into my sleeping bag inside the tent, I thought I heard something in the distance. A faint noise, barely audible, but distinct enough to make me pause. It wasn't the wind or the usual animal sounds. It sounded like something moving through the woods, slowly, carefully. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a small bear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. I tried to ignore it, curling up deeper into my sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easily. The night stretched on, and the noise continued. I could hear the occasional snapping of twigs and the rustling of leaves. It was getting closer. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to listen. My flashlight was within arm's reach, and I had a pocket knife on me just in case. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But every instinct I had was telling me to be alert. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I slipped out of my sleeping bag and grabbed the flashlight. Quietly, I unzipped the tent and peered out into the dark. The fire had long since burned out, and the moonlight barely pierced through the thick canopy of trees above me. The woods were still, too still. I waited, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing. The noise had stopped. It was like the forest had gone completely silent, as if holding its breath. I stood there, staring into the darkness, but nothing moved. No rustling, no sounds of footsteps, only the wind whispering through the leaves. I couldn't bring myself to go back to sleep, not with that feeling gnawing at me. So, I sat there for a while, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, waiting for something, anything. The wind began to pick up, and the trees above me creaked and groaned. It was a strange, unsettling sound, but I tried to convince myself it was just nature at work. Around midnight, I finally decided to get some rest. The noise, whatever it had been, had faded into the background of my mind. I crawled back into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to relax. But it was impossible to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The woods felt alive in a way that wasn't comforting. There was an unnatural stillness that seemed to press in from every side, as though the forest was watching me. At some point, I must have drifted off, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I kept waking up, heart racing, certain I'd heard something outside. The night dragged on like that, each hour feeling longer than the last. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted, my nerves on edge. I unzipped the tent and crawled out into the daylight, squinting at the bright sun. The forest, now bathed in the early morning light, looked beautiful. Birds chirped in the distance, and the air was fresh. But there was still that feeling, the one I couldn't shake. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the trees looming around me like silent sentinels. I spent the day walking around, trying to clear my mind. The noises from the night before still lingered in my thoughts, but I kept telling myself it was nothing. I couldn't explain it, but I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin the trip. After a few hours of exploring, I came back to my camp. Everything looked normal. The tent was still standing, my pack was where I left it, and the campfire ring was empty. I felt a little more at ease, but the unease still hung in the air. As I sat down by the fire pit, I noticed something strange. The logs I had stacked in a pile earlier were no longer stacked neatly. They were scattered across the ground. It wasn't a huge change, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I was certain I had stacked them properly. Had someone been here? Or had something been here? The idea of someone else being out here, so far from any trail or road, sent a chill down my spine. I looked around, but I saw no signs of anyone. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of recent activity. I spent the rest of the day keeping a close eye on my surroundings. I didn't dare go far from the camp. As the evening approached, I started to pack up, deciding that maybe it was time to head back early. Something in the back of my mind told me to leave, to get out of there before dark. As the sun set, I packed my gear into my backpack and started back the way I came. I felt better with every step I took away from the campsite. The forest seemed less oppressive now, the air lighter. The trail back was longer than I remembered, but I didn't stop. I kept moving, the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and leaves echoing in the stillness. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached my car. I felt a huge wave of relief as I opened the door and climbed in. I started the engine and pulled out of the dirt road, watching the forest shrink away in the rearview mirror. By the time I reached the nearest town, the anxiety that had been gnawing at me all day started to fade. I felt normal again, but as I looked back at the thick line of trees in the distance, a thought crossed my mind. Something had been out there. Something had been watching me. I couldn't explain it. I didn't need to. I just knew that I wouldn't be going back anytime soon. I decided to take a solo camping trip in early October, a time when the forests in northern Idaho were nearly empty, quiet except for the wind moving through the pine trees and the occasional rustle of animals getting ready for winter. I was 35 at the time, and I'd been working nonstop for months without a real break. I thought a few days away from cell service, people, and noise would be good for me. I found a remote campsite through a forum, a place that wasn't part of an official campground but had been used by hunters and other backpackers. It was up in the Clearwater Mountains, about 8 miles from the nearest Forest Service road. You had to hike in with everything you needed. I packed carefully. I brought a 4-season tent, sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a small gas stove, enough food for 5 days, water filters, a map, compass, satellite emergency beacon, and a handgun. I wasn't worried about people. It was bears and mountain lions I had in mind, especially that deep into the woods. I'd been in the backcountry before, but I'd never gone this far alone. Still, I liked the idea of testing myself. The first day was quiet. I parked my truck just off a logging road that looked like it hadn't seen use in years. I left a note on the dash with my name, the date, and where I was headed, just in case something happened. The trail wasn't marked, but the directions from the forum were good. I hiked in with my pack and made it to the old campsite by mid-afternoon. It sat in a flat clearing surrounded by tall trees, maybe 100 yards from a narrow creek. There were signs that others had used the site before. Flattened grass, a ring of rocks for a fire pit, and a fallen log someone had dragged over to sit on. I set up my tent near the tree line, facing the creek. The air smelled clean and cold, and I could hear nothing but water running and wind in the branches. I boiled some water for dinner and ate quietly as the sky darkened. I had no phone signal, of course, and once the sun dropped behind the mountains, the cold came fast. I crawled into my sleeping bag before it was even fully dark and lay there listening to the forest. I wasn't scared. If anything, I felt calm. The kind of calm you only get when you're deep in the wild and completely alone. The first night passed without anything strange. I slept lighter than usual, alert to any sound outside the tent, but nothing stood out. I woke with the sun and unzipped the tent to find a thick fog hanging over everything. The trees looked like they were floating in smoke. I made coffee, stretched out my legs, and walked down to the creek to wash my face. The cold water bit into my skin, but it felt good. I spent most of the day exploring. I followed the creek upstream for maybe 2 miles, looking for animal tracks, listening to birds. I found a pile of moose droppings and some scratch marks on a tree that looked like a bear had been there earlier in the season. I kept my pistol on my belt just in case, but I didn't see anything bigger than a squirrel. Around late afternoon, I turned back and headed for camp. That's when I noticed something small but strange. Near my tent, the leaves had been disturbed. I could see clear marks where something or someone had walked near the tent flap. Not a lot of prints, but enough that I paused. I thought maybe it was a deer or some other animal that had wandered close. I checked for food smells, made sure nothing was left out. Everything looked untouched. My food was sealed, hanging from a tree, and the tent was closed just like I left it. Still, I felt that prickle on the back of my neck, the one you get when something's just a little off. That night, I slept a bit lighter. I kept the pistol near my sleeping bag and tried to tell myself it was nothing. But around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunching outside the tent, like someone stepping slowly over dry leaves. I froze. I didn't turn on my headlamp or make any noise. I just lay there listening. The steps were slow, deliberate, not the kind of movement you'd expect from a deer or a raccoon. They moved around the tent once, then faded into the trees. I waited, heart pounding, for what felt like an hour before I fell back asleep. The next morning, there were more prints. This time, they were clearer. Human boots, not mine. I wear size 12 hiking boots with a specific tread pattern, and these were different. Smaller, a bit narrower. The person had walked up to the tent, circled around, and then headed off toward the creek. I scanned the trees, looked for movement, listened. Nothing. I told myself it could be another camper, someone passing through, maybe hunting. But this wasn't public land, and I hadn't heard any gunshots or voices. And what kind of hunter walks up to someone's tent in the middle of the night without saying anything? I thought about leaving, but I didn't want to panic. I planned 5 days, and I didn't want to cut the trip short over something that might be nothing. I still had my gun, food, gear, and I'd let someone know where I was. I stayed. That day, I didn't explore much. I stayed near camp, watched the trees, listened more carefully. I saw no one. As the sun dipped again, the cold settled in. I cooked quickly, ate fast, and packed everything away tight. I went to sleep with the pistol in my hand. It was just past midnight when I heard it again. This time, the steps were closer, slower, right outside the tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then something touched the fabric. Not hard, just enough to press it inward slightly. A hand, maybe. Paused. Then nothing. The sound of leaves crunching again. Fading. Then gone. In the morning, there were no new prints. I checked every inch of the ground, confused. I knew what I'd heard. I started to think I was losing it. Maybe it had been the wind. Maybe animals. I walked to the creek to get water and nearly dropped my bottle when I saw it. Wedged under a rock, half in the water, was a small, broken piece of plastic. A piece of a headlamp. Not mine. I picked it up, examined it. The battery casing was cracked, the elastic strap torn. It looked old, but not ancient. Someone had dropped it recently, or maybe someone had been watching me. Now I was worried. I packed up a few essentials: food, gun, water filter, flashlight, and marked a spot about a mile away where I could stay temporarily if I had to. I didn't want to abandon camp completely, but I needed options. I tried to stay calm, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. That night was dead silent. No wind, no water noise. Even the animals seemed to be keeping their distance. I lay there wide awake, waiting. Around 3 a.m., I heard something new. A distant click. Then another. Metal on metal, like a carabiner or gear being clipped together. I sat up slowly and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. There was a faint glow about 50 yards away through the trees. A small light, like a headlamp. It moved slowly, side to side, sweeping the ground. I killed my own light and watched. The beam moved closer, then stopped. Whoever it was stood still for several minutes, just facing my direction. I couldn't see their face, just the light. Then they turned and walked away. No words, no sound, just gone. At dawn, I made the decision to leave. I packed fast, stripped the site, scattered the fire ring, and started back toward the truck. I moved fast but careful, scanning the trees. I stopped every few minutes to listen. The hike out took almost 3 hours, and I didn't see anyone. Not one person, but about halfway back, I found something that chilled me. Hanging from a tree branch about head height was a small plastic bag. Inside was a lighter, a torn glove, and a photo. The photo was of a different campsite. Not mine, but there was a tent in it. A blue one, similar in size to mine. Someone had taken a picture of it, printed it, and left it there, like a message. I didn't touch it. I just kept moving. When I finally reached my truck, I didn't relax. Not until I was several miles down the road with the forest behind me. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near the highway. I washed my face, bought a coffee, and sat in the lot for almost an hour. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not then. I just drove home and unpacked. A few weeks later, I went back to the forum where I found the directions to that site. The post was gone. The user account had been deleted. I searched the site for similar locations, but I never found that exact one again. I never went back to Idaho, never camped alone again. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but they knew where I was. They got close enough to touch the tent, and they didn't make a sound. It's been a few years now. I still camp, but only with others. I still think about that moment when the tent fabric moved, just slightly, like a finger pushing in. I still remember the headlamp in the trees, not moving, just watching. And I still wonder how many times they came to the camp before I even noticed. I don't think it was a random hunter. I think someone used that forum to lure people out there. People like me, looking for quiet, for peace, for solitude. I was lucky. I left before anything worse happened. But someone else might not have. That piece of headlamp I found, the glove, the photo, that stuff. It was late August in 2022 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the northern part of Vermont. I'd been working long hours at a welding shop just outside of Boston, and my back hurt from being bent over steel every day. I hadn't taken any real time off in months, so when I managed to carve out 4 days for myself, I threw my gear into the back of my old truck and headed north without much of a plan. I just knew I wanted silence, trees, and a spot away from anyone else. I picked out a place after looking over a satellite map for about 15 minutes in a gas station parking lot. The area was called Wild Brook Basin, not marked as an official campsite, but it looked remote enough and surrounded by state forest. There were no trails marked, no ranger stations, just dense woods and a few logging roads that hadn't been used in a while. That was exactly what I wanted. No neighbors, no noise, no lights. I filled up the tank, bought a few last-minute supplies like an extra can of bear spray, a big jug of water, and some instant coffee. I already had my food packed, mostly cans, trail mix, and some dried meat. I had my old green tent, a decent sleeping bag, a collapsible shovel, and a small camp stove I rarely used. My plan was to hike about 2 miles in from the main gravel road and find a clearing to set up camp. I got to the edge of Wild Brook Basin just before dark. The logging road I turned onto was narrow, overgrown in places, and barely wide enough for my truck. I had to back up once after nearly getting stuck in a soft patch. Then I parked in a small opening just off the trail. From there, I threw on my pack and hiked in with my headlamp on. I went in deeper than I originally planned, probably closer to 3 miles, mostly because I didn't see any good clearings right away. The forest was thick with pine, maple, and clusters of birch. The air smelled clean and sharp. I finally found a flat, quiet spot next to a rocky stream. There were a few big boulders around, a good space to set up the tent, and enough fallen wood nearby to keep a fire going for hours. I set up camp quickly, more by feel than sight, since the sun was already gone. After I got the fire going, I sat down and listened to the wind pushing through the tops of the trees. It was completely quiet, except for the occasional crack of a branch or the gurgle of the stream nearby. I didn't see any signs of other campers. No trash, no fire rings, no disturbed ground. It felt like no one had been there in years. That first night was peaceful. I didn't sleep well, but I rarely do the first night out. Every small sound made my eyes snap open. There were plenty of them. Something rustling through the leaves, probably a squirrel or a rabbit, maybe a raccoon. I heard an owl at one point and something larger moving in the brush just after midnight. I reached for the bear spray just in case and waited, but it moved on and I eventually drifted off. The next morning I woke up cold. The fire had died out and my breath was fogging the air inside the tent. I crawled out stiff and groggy, my knees aching from the uneven ground. I made coffee, warmed up some jerky over the fire, and walked down to the stream to wash my face. It was after breakfast that I noticed the first thing that felt off. Near the edge of the stream, About 20 feet from my tent, I saw a set of footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. I'd been wearing hiking boots, and these were bare feet. Human feet. The prints were small, maybe a size 8 or 9, and the toes were clearly visible. I crouched down and studied them for a while. They were fresh, edges sharp, not smoothed by rain or wind. There were 5 of them in total, heading downstream. I followed them for about 10 yards before they disappeared into a patch of thicker grass and moss. I stood there for a minute, listening. I didn't hear anything, no voices, no movement. I told myself it was probably another hiker, someone who wandered through barefoot for whatever reason. Maybe they liked feeling the ground under their feet. People do weird things all the time, but something about the prints made me uneasy. They were too close to my camp. I hadn't heard anyone come near during the night. I went back to camp and checked my gear. Nothing was missing, nothing moved. My tent was zipped the same way I left it, and the food was untouched. I even checked my truck, though it was miles away and out of sight. I stayed around the camp most of the day, gathering wood, exploring a bit, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I kept the fire going longer. I sat close to it, bear spray and a small hatchet within reach. I didn't hear anything strange, but I kept thinking about those prints. Who had been out here? Why barefoot? Why so close to my tent? I listened harder than I normally would, and the forest seemed too quiet. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. It was soft at first, like something brushing against fabric. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath. The sound came again, a light scratching, not from outside the tent, from above. My tent had a mesh ceiling with a rainfly over it. Something was brushing against it slowly, deliberately. I rolled onto my back and stared upward, barely breathing. The noise stopped, and for a long time there was nothing. Then, I heard a faint shift of weight, like someone stepping carefully near the entrance. I reached for the bear spray and waited, heart pounding in my ears. I didn't move. The zipper didn't open. Nothing else happened. I stayed like that for at least an hour, body tense, until light began to bleed into the trees. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside, everything looked normal. The fire pit had gone cold. My gear was untouched, but when I looked around the back of the tent, I saw a mark in the dirt, a small smear, like something had knelt there. I checked the top of the tent and saw a bit of pine needle debris disturbed, like someone or something had leaned on it. That was enough for me. I packed up my things fast. I didn't eat. I barely drank water. I just tore everything down, stuffed it into my pack, and started back toward the truck. The hike out felt longer than I remembered. The forest seemed thicker, darker somehow. I kept looking over my shoulder. Halfway back, I stopped for a break near a fallen tree and noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a small scrap of fabric caught on a branch, hanging low over the trail. It was a strip of gray cloth, torn, maybe from a shirt or pants. I checked it, no markings, no tags, but it looked fairly clean. Not old, not weathered. The rest of the hike was fast. I got back to my truck around noon, loaded my gear, and slammed the doors shut. I sat there for a minute before starting the engine, eyes scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No sound except the idling truck. I got back on the gravel road and drove until I hit pavement. I didn't stop until I reached a small town with a diner. I sat inside for an hour drinking bad coffee and trying to make sense of what had happened. No one had stolen anything. Nothing was broken. But I knew I hadn't been alone out there. I didn't report it. There was nothing to report, really. Just some footprints, a strange noise, a scrap of fabric. No crime, no evidence. Just a bad feeling and a sense that I'd been watched closely, maybe even touched while I slept. A few weeks later, I went back and looked up Wild Brook Basin. It turns out there were a few mentions of disappearances in that general area going back years. Nothing major, just the odd hiker that didn't return, a missing camper or two from the 90s. No confirmed crimes, no major investigations. Just enough to make me feel justified in what I felt out there. I haven't been back to that area since. I still camp, but I stay in marked campgrounds now with other people nearby. I still bring my bear spray, and now I keep a trail cam pointed at my tent. I sleep a little lighter, and I always checked the ground for footprints. Whatever was out there didn't hurt me, didn't take anything, didn't make itself known in any clear way. But it got close, too close, and I have no doubt that if I'd stayed another night, something would have happened. Maybe it would have been nothing, but maybe it would have been the kind of thing no one ever comes back from. Leaving when I did was the best decision I've ever made. I'd always liked going out alone into the woods. It made me feel calm, like everything else in the world disappeared for a while. No work stress, no traffic, no constant beeping of phones or the pressure of being available all the time. Just trees, birds, dirt under my boots, and my thoughts. I wasn't a complete survivalist or anything, but I'd been on enough solo camping trips to know how to take care of myself. I always packed smart, planned my routes, and told someone where I'd be, even if it was just a friend through a quick text. This time, I wanted to try a more remote area than usual. I live in Northern California, and there are plenty of backcountry trails up in the Klamath Mountains that people don't often visit. I found a loop trail about 16 miles long that crossed two ridgelines and dropped down into a valley with a creek running through it. It looked peaceful, scenic, and most importantly, quiet. I planned to spend 3 days out there, hike in about 6 miles the first day, set up camp near the creek, spend the second day exploring the valley, then hike back out the third day. The morning I left, I double-checked my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water filter, stove, first aid kit, knife, compass, paper map, fire starter, flashlight with extra batteries, bear spray. I was used to this. I wasn't worried. I parked my car at the small dirt pull-off near the trailhead. There were no other vehicles around. It was mid-September, so most of the summer campers had cleared out. I liked it that way. The air was crisp but not cold. The sun filtered through the pine trees, and I could hear the wind moving through the branches. I hoisted my pack onto my back and started walking. The trail was narrow, but it was still clear and easy to follow. I didn't see a single soul for the first 2 hours. Birds chirped in the trees. Squirrels darted across the path. I kept a steady pace and made it to the top of the first ridgeline by early afternoon. From there, I could see layers of green mountains stretching in all directions. No roads, no houses, no towers, just wilderness. After a quick lunch of jerky and trail mix, I continued hiking down into the valley. I passed a small stream that fed into the larger creek I'd be camping near. The trees grew denser down there, mostly tall firs with thick undergrowth, ferns and fallen logs covered in moss. The only sounds were the water and my footsteps. I reached the spot I'd picked out on the map by about 4 p.m. A flat area near a bend in the creek with a soft bed of pine needles and a few large rocks for sitting. I dropped my pack and stretched. The place felt perfect. I pitched my tent in a small clearing, set out my sleeping bag, and filtered some water from the creek. As the light started to fade, I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, rice and dehydrated vegetables. I sat on a rock while I ate, staring at the water flowing gently past. The air cooled quickly, and the forest around me darkened. I zipped into my sleeping bag just after nightfall and lay there listening to the sounds of the woods. Crickets, distant owls, the occasional snap of a twig. I wasn't afraid. I was used to those kinds of sounds. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why. There was no noise, no obvious reason to be awake. But I felt alert, like something had changed. I stayed still and listened. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard a faint rustling outside my tent. Not an animal moving fast like a deer or raccoon. It sounded more like slow, deliberate steps through the brush. I sat up, heart pounding. I reached quietly for my flashlight and turned it on. I unzipped the tent just a little and shone the light out into the dark. Nothing. I waited. The sound had stopped. Maybe it had just been a branch falling or a small animal after all. I tried to calm down, zipped the tent shut, and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I got up with the sun. Everything looked normal. The creek flowed the same, the sky was clear, and there were no signs of anything unusual. I made coffee, ate some oatmeal, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before. That day, I hiked farther down the valley with just a small day pack. I followed the creek for about 2 miles, took pictures of some interesting rock formations, and sat on a boulder in the sun for a while. I didn't see any signs of people, no boot prints, no trash, no paths leading off the main trail. That was one of the reasons I liked this area. It felt untouched. When I got back to my camp in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. One of the side pockets on my backpack was unzipped. I was sure I had zipped it the night before. I checked the contents. My fire starter and spare flashlight were still there. Nothing was missing. I told myself I must have left it open and just didn't remember. That night, after dinner, I sat near the fire I'd built in the fire ring. I didn't always make fires, but that evening I felt like I needed the comfort of the light. As the fire crackled and the sky turned black, I started to get that feeling again, like I was being watched. I turned off my headlamp and stared out into the woods, hoping my eyes would adjust. It was dead silent. No wind, no night birds, just the low murmur of the creek. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I put out the fire completely, just like I was taught, and climbed into my tent early. I kept the bear spray and knife next to my sleeping bag. I lay there, eyes wide open, for what felt like hours. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke again around 2 or 3 a.m. This time, I was sure I heard something. Slow, soft steps on pine needles. A pause. Then another step. Closer. I didn't move. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped just outside the tent. Who or whatever it was just stood there. I felt frozen. I didn't want to make a sound. I waited in total silence, clutching the bear spray. I could hear my own heartbeat. After what felt like minutes, the steps moved away, slow, deliberate, like whoever it was didn't care about being quiet. The sound faded into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. When the sun rose, I stepped out and looked around the campsite. There were no tracks I could see, just the usual disturbed pine needles. But everything felt off, like someone had gone through my stuff again. The food bag I had hung on a tree branch was slightly swaying, though there was no wind. I checked it, it was untouched. Still, I didn't like it. I made a decision then. I'd cut the trip short and hike out that day instead of staying another night. I quickly packed up camp, stuffed everything into my pack, and started hiking out. I didn't even eat breakfast. As I climbed the ridge again, I kept checking behind me. I felt paranoid, but I couldn't help it. I didn't want to see anyone. I didn't want to hear anything. I just wanted to be back near my car and drive home. About 3 miles in, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were boot prints on the trail, fresh ones. They weren't mine. I could tell because of the tread pattern. Mine had a wide V pattern. These had a tighter zigzag. I stopped and looked closer. The prints were headed in the same direction I was going, from deeper in the woods toward the trailhead. Had someone been following me? I kept walking faster now. I scanned the woods constantly. The trail started to look unfamiliar, but I knew I hadn't taken a wrong turn. It was the only clear path. Still, I didn't like the feeling. Everything felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. About a mile from the trailhead, I came around a bend and froze. A makeshift campsite sat just 20 feet off the trail, hidden behind a thick clump of brush. I hadn't seen it on the way in, and it wasn't marked on any map. It looked rough, just a small tarp tied between trees, a few items scattered around. An old backpack, a tarp-covered box, some plastic jugs. No sign of anyone there, but the fire pit was fresh, still warm. Someone had stayed there recently. I didn't go closer. I didn't want to know more. I turned back to the trail and kept moving. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was still there, alone. I looked behind me one last time before getting in. Nothing, just trees. I drove away without stopping until I hit the main road an hour later. Only then did I take a deep breath. When I got home, I thought a lot about what had happened. I never saw a face. I never heard a voice. But someone had been out there, watching, following, maybe going through my stuff, maybe standing right outside my tent in the middle of the night. I reported what I saw to the forest ranger station. The guy at the desk took notes and thanked me, said they'd check it out. That kind of thing wasn't common. but it wasn't unheard of either. Sometimes people live off-grid out there. Sometimes they don't want to be found. I haven't gone back to that part of the forest. I still go camping, but I stay in areas where I know there'll be at least a few other hikers around. I pack the same gear. I hike the same way, but I always listen a little harder at night, and I always double-check the zipper on my tent. It was the second week of October when I decided to take a solo camping trip out to the mountains near Canyon City, Colorado. I had been working straight for months, and I just needed to be alone for a while. Not the kind of alone where you're in your apartment ignoring texts and emails, but real isolation. No signal, no people, just woods, wind, and time to breathe. I've been camping all my life, so I figured this would be like a reset. I wasn't doing anything fancy, just a tent, a camp stove, some basic food, and a pack of gear. I wanted quiet, and I got it. I drove up to a little used forest road about 45 minutes outside the nearest town. It was the kind of road where you feel your tires grip more dirt and rock than pavement, winding deep into the trees. There wasn't a proper campground where I was going. I had marked a few potential spots on my map, just clearings I'd read about on forums and checked out on satellite view. I parked my car on a grassy pull-off and walked another 2 miles to a flat stretch near a ridge that overlooked a narrow valley. No trails, no fire pits, no signs of recent use. That's what I wanted. The trees up there were mostly pine and spruce, and the underbrush was thin, so it was easy to find a flat spot for the tent. I set up camp in the early afternoon. My tent went up in a little clearing surrounded by trees, but with just enough of a break to the west to catch a view of the sunset. I cooked a quick meal of beans and rice on my little stove and sat on a log eating in silence, the cold creeping in as the sun dipped behind the trees. There were no animal sounds, no bugs humming, just wind and the occasional crack of a twig falling somewhere in the forest. I didn't think anything of the silence. In higher elevations, especially in the fall, it's not unusual. That night, I slept deep, the kind of sleep that hits you when you haven't felt real quiet in months. I woke up around 3 a.m. briefly, had to pee, and stepped outside into the freezing dark. The stars were so sharp they looked fake, just too many to process. I stood there for a few minutes, shivering, listening. Nothing. I finished, crawled back into my sleeping bag, and drifted off again. The next day was more of the same. I hiked a bit, about 5 miles out and back, just exploring the woods. I saw deer tracks, some old bear scat, and a ton of birds. It was peaceful in a way that almost felt eerie. Too quiet sometimes. I didn't even hear the usual rustling of small animals in the brush. I chalked it up to the colder weather. Still, I was in good spirits. I boiled some water, made coffee, and just sat there reading a paperback I'd brought. I think it was sometime around dusk, maybe a little after 5, when I started to get that weird feeling in my gut. I was cleaning my small pot when I noticed it. Something felt off. I wasn't scared, not yet, just alert, like I was being watched. It wasn't like in movies where you hear a sound and whip your head around. It was more like my skin knew something my eyes couldn't see. I stood up and scanned the tree line, not moving much, just rotating from the hips and looking as naturally as I could. Nothing, just trees and shadows. But still, I felt it. I told myself it was nothing. Could have been a deer watching me from the woods. Maybe even a bear that had caught my scent and was waiting to make a move on my food when I turned in. I hung my food bag higher in the tree that night just in case. It was a little harder because the wind had picked up and the branch I'd chosen kept swaying. Took me nearly 20 minutes to get it done. By the time I finished, it was fully dark. I turned off my headlamp and sat in the dark for a while, just letting my eyes adjust, letting myself hear what was out there. Still nothing. No steps, no breath, no movement. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to sleep. Took me a while to fall asleep. I kept hearing things, or at least thinking I heard things. Small rustles, light cracks, the kind of sounds the forest always makes but that feel louder when you're expecting them. Around midnight, I heard what I thought was footsteps. Not right outside, not that close, but close enough. The rhythm wasn't right for an animal. Too slow, too careful. I held my breath and listened. 5, maybe 6 steps. Then nothing. I laid there frozen for a while. I didn't turn on my light. I didn't move. I just waited. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning and light was coming through the tent walls. I got up, checked the camp. Everything was exactly how I'd left it. My food was untouched. No prints that I could see. Just a cold, breezy morning and a sky so clear it hurt to look at. I convinced myself I'd imagined the footsteps. Maybe it was an animal walking in a strange pattern. I didn't want to leave yet, even if I felt uneasy. I had one more full day and night planned, and it still felt worth it. That day, I stayed closer to camp. I didn't hike far. I just explored the area, checked the ridgeline, looked for better vantage points, and did a little carving on a piece of pine I'd found. I tried to distract myself. That afternoon, I found something strange maybe half a mile from my camp. It looked like a pile of small bones, ribs and vertebrae, maybe from a rabbit or a bird, but they'd been arranged in a kind of pattern. Not like art or symbols, just too clean, too intentional. The bones were laid out in parallel lines, almost like someone had sorted them by size. There were no signs of fur or feathers, no blood. I stood over it for a long time, staring, trying to convince myself that an animal had done it, or maybe a natural process I didn't understand. But I knew better. I didn't touch it. I just backed away and walked back to my camp in a wide arc, watching the woods the whole time. I felt exposed. Every movement in the trees looked like a person ducking out of view. I started to imagine shapes in the shadows. Branches looked like limbs. My ears were too tuned in. Every gust of wind made me jump. When I got back to camp, everything was still fine, but the feeling wouldn't leave. It was like the woods themselves didn't want me there anymore. I cooked fast, barely ate, and kept my jacket on even near the fire. I packed some essentials into my day pack and kept it inside the tent with me. Knife, flashlight, snacks, lighter. I decided if anything happened that night, I'd leave. Even if it meant walking the 2 miles back to the car in the dark. That night was the longest of my life. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Around 11 p.m., I started hearing movement again, this time closer. It sounded like slow steps, then stopping, then again. I turned on my headlamp and waited. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might be louder than the sounds outside. I unzipped the tent just an inch and peeked out. I couldn't see anything, just shapes of trees. Then I heard it breathing. Not mine. It was soft but there, just outside the tent. I froze. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Then the breathing stopped. No footsteps, no retreat, just gone. I stayed like that for a long time. I finally turned off the light and stayed perfectly still, gripping my knife inside the bag. I don't think I slept at all. I must have dozed a little because next thing I remember it was morning and light was filling the tent again. I burst out of the tent and looked around. Nothing. But there, 10 feet from my tent, were boot prints. Human boot prints, deep in the dirt. They led toward my tent from the east, stopped right outside, and then turned and disappeared back into the trees. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing. My food bag was still hanging. No damage to the tent. That was it. I was done. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't even eat. I just got it all in my pack, doused the fire ring, and started walking. I kept my knife in one hand and didn't stop to rest. That 2-mile walk to the car felt like 20. I kept hearing things. Snaps, crunches, light rustling. I never saw anyone, but I knew I was being followed. I never ran, just kept walking fast and steady. My heart wouldn't slow down. It wasn't panic. It was survival. When I finally saw my car, I almost dropped to my knees. I threw my pack into the back seat and got in, locking the doors before I even turned the key. I drove out of there without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, and even then I kept going until I reached the main highway. I drove straight home. That night, I didn't sleep either. I kept thinking about those footprints, the breathing, the bones in the woods. Someone had been watching me out there. Maybe more than one person. Maybe they'd been there the whole time. I kept replaying every moment in my head, trying to figure out if I had missed something earlier. A sign, a warning. I hadn't seen anyone on my hike in. No other cars, no camps, But that didn't mean they weren't there. It's been months now and I still think about it. I haven't been camping since. I don't know if I ever will again. Not like that, anyway. Not alone. Not deep in the woods. I still have no idea who or what was out there with me. Maybe it was just someone trying to scare me. Or maybe they were planning something worse and changed their mind. I'll never know. What I do know is this: next time I need to get away, I'll stay where there's cell service and streetlights. Some kinds of silence aren't peaceful. I decided to take a break from everything for a few days and spend some time alone in the mountains. I'd been working a desk job for years, and I was getting tired of the routine. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. I needed to get out and breathe. It was late September, and the leaves were just starting to change. The air was crisp but not cold. Felt like the right time to get away. I picked an area in northern Oregon, a few hours from Portland. I'd been there once before with some friends a few years back, and I remembered it being quiet and far from the touristy stuff. There was a national forest with a bunch of off-grid trails, and I knew one that led to a small lake up in the hills. That's where I wanted to go. I packed up my gear, enough food for 3 nights, filled my backpack with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, stove, first aid, a good knife, flashlight, extra batteries, and my old GPS, and headed out early Friday morning. The drive was easy. I reached the trailhead by mid-afternoon. There was one other car in the dirt lot, but I didn't see or hear anyone around. I locked my car, slung my backpack on, and started walking. The trail was narrow and uneven, covered in pine needles and small rocks. I could smell the forest right away, that sharp, clean scent of fir and cedar. I followed the trail for a little over 2 hours, going uphill most of the way until I reached the lake. It wasn't big, maybe 100 yards across, but it was beautiful. The water was still, reflecting the trees around it like a mirror. I found a small clearing near the edge and set up my tent. I got the fire started just as the sun began to dip behind the hills. The smoke curled slowly into the air, and I sat down to eat a quick meal from one of my freeze-dried packs. Everything felt calm. I didn't hear anything out of place. Just the occasional rustling of small animals in the brush and the sound of wind moving through the trees. That first night went by quietly. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets. The next morning, I woke up just after sunrise. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, so I pulled on an extra layer and made coffee by the fire. I planned to hike around the lake a bit and maybe explore some of the less obvious trails that splintered off from the main one. I spent a good part of the day wandering through the forest, occasionally marking trees with little strips of bright orange cloth so I could find my way back easily. I didn't run into anyone, which didn't surprise me. The area was remote, and most people stuck to the bigger campgrounds miles away. Everything was going fine until late in the afternoon. I was following a narrow animal trail deeper into the woods, farther from the lake than I'd gone before, when I noticed something strange. There was a pile of broken branches stacked against a tree, like someone had tried to build a crude shelter but gave up halfway. It looked recent. The wood hadn't weathered or grayed. Some of the smaller branches still had green leaves. I crouched down and looked around but didn't see anything else. No footprints, no gear, no sign of anyone nearby. It just felt off. I backed away from it and followed my markers back toward camp. When I got back, everything looked fine. My tent was untouched. Fire pit was just as I'd left it. But as I was unpacking my bag, I realized one of the orange cloth strips I'd used earlier that day was sitting near the edge of the fire pit. I hadn't brought any back with me. I knew I'd left all of them tied to trees. I stood there for a while just staring at it. Maybe I dropped it somehow. Maybe it fell off and stuck to my shoe. But it didn't feel right. I stuffed it in my pocket and kept the fire going until well after sunset. I didn't sleep as easily that night. The next morning, I got up early again and went back to the spot where I saw the branches stacked against the tree. This time, the pile was gone. Completely gone. The branches weren't there, and the ground looked disturbed, like someone had kicked around the leaves and dirt to cover up any trace of it. I stood in that spot for a long time, trying to decide if I should just pack up and leave. But part of me didn't want to let paranoia ruin the trip. I told myself it was just some hunter or backpacker messing around. I tried to shake it off. That night, after dinner, I sat near the fire trying to relax. The forest was quiet again, but too quiet. No wind, no rustling, no insects, just complete stillness. That kind of silence starts to press in on you after a while. You start noticing every little sound, like the creak of a tree or a faint snap of a twig somewhere out in the dark. At one point, I thought I saw movement on the far side of the lake, just a quick shadow slipping between the trees. I stared at the spot for a long time but saw nothing else. I convinced myself it was just a deer. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. There was no loud noise, no flash of light, just a heavy feeling in my chest, like I'd been startled awake. I sat up and listened. For a minute, I didn't hear anything. Then, from somewhere just outside the tent, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the leaves. Not an animal. Too slow, too steady. I grabbed my knife and sat frozen. The steps circled the tent once, then stopped. I held my breath. Minutes passed. Nothing. When I finally worked up the nerve, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a weak light, but I didn't see anyone. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping that knife and listening to every sound. When the sun came up, I stepped outside. I walked the area slowly, checking the ground. There were marks, faint impressions in the soil where someone had walked. The tracks were fresh and clearly made by boots. They led from the woods, circled my tent, and disappeared back into the trees. That was it for me. I packed up everything in record time. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just threw everything into my bag and started back down the trail. I kept my knife in hand the whole time. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. I checked over my shoulder constantly. About halfway back to the trailhead, I noticed something else. One of the orange cloth markers I'd tied on the first day was gone. Not torn or hanging loose, just completely gone. I knew it had been there. I double-checked it on the way in. Then another marker was gone. Then another. It was like someone had walked behind me the whole time, removing them one by one. I started moving faster. I didn't stop for water. I just kept walking until I finally saw the parking area through the trees. My car was still there. The other vehicle was gone. I got inside, locked the doors, and sat there for a while, trying to calm down. My heart was racing. My hands were shaking. Eventually, I started the engine and drove back toward the highway. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station a good 20 miles away. I sat in the lot and just let myself breathe for a bit. That was the last time I went camping alone. I still think about those nights sometimes, especially the sound of those footsteps and the missing markers. Whoever was out there, they never tried to hurt me. They didn't take anything, didn't damage my gear. But they wanted me to know they were there. They wanted me to feel watched. And it worked. I'll never know who it was or why they did it. But I know I wasn't alone out there. I know someone was following me, moving just out of sight, playing a quiet game in the woods. Now when I go out into the wild, I stick to populated trails. I go with friends. I don't wander off alone. I don't mark my path with anything that someone else could use. That trip changed the way I see the woods. It showed me that the scariest things out there aren't monsters or ghosts. They're the people you never see. The ones who don't make a sound. The ones who don't want to be found. It was the second week of September, and the weather was just starting to cool down in southern Idaho. The summer heat had backed off, and the leaves on some of the trees had started to change color, giving the forest a quiet kind of beauty that I liked. I had taken time off work to go on a solo camping trip. Just me, my gear, and the woods. I needed the break. Work had been eating me alive lately, and I hadn't really slept well in over a month. I figured some time away, some hiking and camping alone, would help clear my head. I picked a national forest I'd been to once before, a few hours west of Idaho Falls. The last time I was there, it was with a group of friends. We didn't even hike in far, just set up camp a mile or so from the trailhead. This time, I planned to go deeper, I wanted real silence, to be far away from people, phones, and traffic noise. I studied the forest map for days and found a trail that wasn't too popular and led off into a less traveled section of the forest. According to the map, there were some old logging roads that crossed the trail, but most of them had been closed off for years. That meant fewer people, which was perfect for what I was looking for. I left on a Monday morning. My gear was packed the night before: tent, sleeping bag, small stove, food for 5 days, a water filter, some basic first aid, and the usual survival gear. I also had a hunting knife and a small hatchet strapped to the side of my pack. I brought a GPS, but I preferred using the map and compass. I didn't plan to go far off the trail, but if I did, I wanted to rely on skills, not a screen. I made sure everything was double-checked and ready to go. The last thing I wanted was to hike 10 miles in and realize I forgot a lighter or something dumb like that. I parked at the trailhead around 11 a.m. and signed the logbook at the ranger box. There were only 2 other names on the list from the past week. That was good. The sky was clear, and the temperature was somewhere in the 60s. Just cool enough that hiking didn't feel like work. I took my time going in. The trail wound through thick pines, up along a slow incline that eventually leveled out near a narrow stream. The sound of the water running over rocks was the only thing I heard for a while. No planes, no cars, no people. It was exactly what I wanted. By late afternoon, I found a flat spot on a slight hill that overlooked the stream. It was maybe 200 feet off the trail. I could barely see the path from where I was, which meant no one else would see my camp unless they were looking for it. I set up the tent, got a small fire going in the ring I built from nearby rocks, and made a simple meal, just rice and beans. As the sun went down, the forest got quiet in that way only forests do. The kind of silence that feels thick, like the trees are holding their breath. I sat there for a long time after it got dark, just listening to the wind move through the branches above me. That first night went fine. I didn't sleep great, but that was mostly because it was the first night out, and my body was still adjusting to the ground. I got up early the next morning, filtered water from the stream, and made coffee. I spent the day hiking along the trail, exploring some of the old roads I saw on the map. Most were overgrown, but one in particular looked like it still got some use. The gravel was exposed in places, and there were tire tracks, not fresh but not old either. I followed it for a mile or so until it ended at a large clearing. There were old logs piled up on one side and rusted metal debris on the other, maybe leftovers from when this was an active logging area. I didn't think much of it at the time, just took a few photos and headed back to camp before the sun dipped too low. That night, I heard something walking near my tent. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. It moved too slowly, and the steps were too far apart. I stayed perfectly still and listened. The steps circled halfway around the tent and then stopped. I reached quietly for my knife and waited. My heart was thudding hard enough I could hear it in my ears. After maybe 10 minutes of silence, I unzipped the tent just an inch and peeked out. I didn't see anything. The moonlight filtered through the trees just enough to give some shape to the forest, but there was nothing near the camp. I stayed awake until nearly sunrise, watching and listening. I never heard anything else. By morning, I figured it had just been my imagination or maybe a deer. Still, I felt off all day. The next morning, I decided to hike farther down the trail and maybe look for another spot to camp. I packed up everything, made sure the fire was dead, and started walking around mid-morning. About 4 miles in, I came to a fork that wasn't marked on my map. One side kept going along the stream, and the other looked like it went uphill towards some ridges. I took the stream route, figuring it'd be easier to follow if I needed to backtrack. About an hour later, I saw something strange off to my left. There was a blue tarp strung up between 2 trees, maybe 40 feet off the trail. It was sagging in the middle, like it had been left there a while. I stopped walking and crouched down. From where I was, I couldn't see anyone around it. No movement, no sound. I watched for a long time. It didn't look like a ranger camp. It was too messy. One corner of the tarp had come loose and was flapping gently in the breeze. I thought about going closer to check it out, but something about it made me uneasy. Felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be seeing it. I backed away and continued along the trail for another couple miles. Eventually, I found another campsite near a bend in the stream. This one felt more hidden. I set up the tent again, kept the fire small, and tried to relax. But I couldn't stop thinking about that tarp. Who set it up? Why there? Why leave it? There hadn't been any signs of people anywhere else on the trail. No boot prints, no trash, nothing. Just that tarp. That night, the forest was dead silent. No wind, no bugs, no birds. Just nothing. I lay in my sleeping bag with my eyes wide open, waiting for some kind of sound. Around 1 a.m., I heard something in the woods again. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was more like a rustling sound, like someone moving through brush. Slow, careful. I held my breath and listened. The sound got closer, stopped, then started again. It moved around my camp just like before, keeping to the shadows. At one point, I thought I saw a figure, just a shape, standing between two trees maybe 30 feet away. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I found a boot print near the fire ring. A real one, not mine. It was larger than mine, too, maybe size 12 or 13. The tread was deep, sharp, like a newer hiking boot. I stood there staring at it for a long time. That wasn't leftover from the trail. The ground around my camp was soft, and there hadn't been any prints there the night before. Whoever it was had come into my camp while I was sleeping. They walked within 10 feet of where I lay inside the tent. I packed everything up fast. No breakfast, no coffee. Just threw it all into the pack and started walking. I didn't care about seeing the rest of the trail anymore. I wanted out. I hiked for hours, barely stopping, keeping an eye on the trees around me. Every so often, I thought I heard something behind me. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but I never saw anyone. I kept moving until I got close to where I'd camped the first night. I considered stopping again, but decided to keep going. I didn't feel safe anymore. The woods no longer felt calm or peaceful. They felt watched. It was getting dark by the time I made it back to the trailhead. My legs were screaming, and my back felt like it was on fire. I signed out in the logbook and noticed that no new names had been added. Just mine and the two older ones. That meant no one else was supposed to be out there. I drove straight home that night, even though it meant getting back at nearly 2 a.m. I didn't care. I just wanted to be away from that place. When I got home, I unpacked and checked through all my gear. That's when I found something that didn't belong. A small scrap of cloth, dark green, tucked into one of the side pockets of my pack. It wasn't mine. I don't even own anything that color. It looked like it had been torn from a jacket or shirt, maybe ripped off. I stared at it for a long time, turning it over in my fingers. It was dirty, smelled like sweat and pine, and had a thread sticking from one edge like it had been yanked hard. That was it for me. I didn't report anything, didn't tell anyone. I just shoved the gear into a storage bin and left it alone. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't know if I ever will again. I used to love the quiet, the peace of being out in the woods alone. But now, when I think about it, I don't feel peace. I feel watched. I feel like I wasn't alone out there. Not just in the way of animals or other hikers. I mean, truly not alone. Like someone knew I was coming, waited, watched me from a distance, and when they got close, they made sure I knew it. I don't know what their reason was. I don't want to know. I just know that I left that forest with all my gear, my life, and a gut-deep understanding that some places aren't meant to be visited alone, no matter how quiet or beautiful they seem. I had been planning the trip for months. The stress at work had piled up so high that I could feel it in my shoulders every time I took a breath. I needed something away from people, noise, and screens. So, I took a week off and decided to go camping by myself. I chose a spot in northern Utah, in a less popular part of the Uinta Mountains. There was a remote area about 5 miles off the main trail, near a small unnamed lake. I'd found it by scanning satellite maps, cross-referencing topographic layers, and reading old backpacking forums. There wasn't much info on it, which made it perfect. I packed everything carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, bear canister, water filter, small axe, fixed blade knife, camp stove, fuel, extra lighters, food for a week, and a solar charger for my phone. I wasn't planning to use the phone much, but I kept it charged for GPS and emergencies. I also brought a small first aid kit, a satellite beacon, and enough layers to handle unexpected weather. I went over the gear checklist again and again, not wanting to forget anything. I left early on a Monday morning and drove 5 hours to a gravel turnout at the end of an old forest road. There were no other cars. I parked the truck, made sure all the windows were shut, locked it, threw on my pack, and started the hike in. The trail was quiet, barely more than a game trail in some parts. It twisted through a thick pine forest, up rocky inclines, down into shallow ravines. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. No planes overhead, no distant road hum. Just wind in the trees and the occasional call of a bird. It took me most of the day to reach the lake. When I got there, I wasn't disappointed. It was small, ringed with trees and thick brush, with a little crescent of sandy shoreline on the north side. The water was clear enough to see stones on the bottom several feet out. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and looked around. There were no signs anyone had camped there in years. No fire rings, no trash, no boot prints. Just deer tracks and pine needles. I picked a flat spot about 20 yards from the shore and set up the tent. Then I collected wood for a small fire. I didn't plan on cooking over it, just wanted the warmth and light. I cleared a circle, made a fire pit with stones, and gathered dry branches from fallen trees nearby. By the time I got it all together, the sun had dropped behind the trees and the lake was shaded. The wind was cool. I lit the fire, boiled some water on the stove, and had a freeze-dried meal while watching the flames. It was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in months, I felt calm. I went to bed early. The night was cold but not unbearable. I had a good sleeping bag and thermals. I lay there listening to the occasional crack of wood settling or distant owl calls. At one point, I heard something move outside the tent, just a light rustling, probably a rabbit or a raccoon. I wasn't worried. I had food in the bear canister locked and set far from the tent. Everything else was packed up. I eventually fell asleep. The next day, I spent time hiking around the area. I didn't go far, maybe a mile or two in different directions. I found some small game trails, a bunch of deer scat, and what looked like an old rusted hunting stand in a tree, maybe a quarter-mile east of the lake. It looked like it hadn't been used in a decade. I explored for a while, then came back and filtered water from the lake. I spent the afternoon fishing with a collapsible rod I brought, caught a couple small trout, and cooked one over the fire. The air was crisp. I didn't see or hear a single person. That second night, something woke me up. I wasn't sure what it was. I didn't hear anything specific, just jolted awake like my body knew something was off. I sat up and listened. There was nothing, just the wind moving gently through the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I unzipped the tent, stuck my head out, and looked around. The fire was out, the stars were bright, and everything looked normal. But it felt different, like something had changed in the environment in a way I couldn't name. I stepped out quietly, put on my boots, and walked around the campsite with my flashlight. Everything was where it should be. Bear canister untouched, fishing gear in its place, tent undisturbed. But near the edge of the woods, I noticed something odd. A line of small sticks had been arranged on the ground in a half circle. I hadn't put them there. They hadn't been there before. I froze. My first thought was animal activity, maybe a curious raccoon or squirrel. But the placement was too neat, too deliberate, like someone had laid them down. I slowly scanned the trees with the flashlight but didn't see anything. Still, I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my back. I picked up the sticks and tossed them randomly into the brush. Then I walked a wider loop around the camp, scanning everything. Nothing else seemed disturbed. No footprints, no sounds, no lights in the distance. Eventually, I went back into the tent, zipped it shut, and laid there awake for hours. The next day, I tried to brush it off, told myself it could have been natural. Wind, falling branches, and animals' nesting behavior. I wanted to enjoy the trip and not spiral. I forced myself to eat, hiked a bit more, and wrote a few things in a small notebook I kept. I didn't see anything else strange that day, but I didn't feel relaxed anymore. I kept checking over my shoulder. Every branch crack made me tense up. I started keeping my knife on me all the time. On the fourth morning, I woke up and noticed something missing. The small folding chair I'd been using was gone. I checked all around the site. It wasn't where I'd left it. It wasn't tipped over. It was just gone. I walked a wide circle around the area, looking through the brush, up into the trees. Nothing. It was like it had vanished. That's when I knew someone had to be out there. Animals don't take chairs. I stood in the middle of the camp, turning slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No sound. I packed up my gear that morning. Not all of it, just the essentials. I planned to hike back to the truck. I'd only been there 3 nights. I still had food left. But something was off, and I didn't want to find out what it was. The walk back would take a good part of the day. When I got to the spot where the trail met the edge of the lake, I saw the boot prints. 2 sets. One was clearly mine from the day I arrived. The other was newer, going in the same direction I had come from. Slightly larger size, deeper impressions. Someone had walked in after me. The prints stopped at my camp, then turned around and went back toward the forest. I followed them a little ways. They disappeared in a patch of rocky ground about 50 yards in. I stood there for a long time, breathing slowly, listening. I went back to grab the rest of my gear. As I approached the tent, I noticed something sticking out from one of the trees. A piece of white fabric. When I got closer, I saw it was a strip of my thermal shirt, the one I'd washed and hung to dry a day earlier. It had been tied around a branch. There was a small smear of something brownish red on it. I didn't touch it. I backed away slowly, packed up everything fast, and started moving. I hiked hard, only stopping a couple times to drink water. The trail felt different on the way back. I kept checking behind me, thinking I heard something. Once I swore I saw movement to the left of the trail, but when I turned to look, there was nothing but brush and trees. When I finally reached the gravel turnout and saw my truck, I nearly cried, but something stopped me in my tracks. The passenger door was open. I know I locked it. I remember checking all the doors before I left. I walked up slowly, holding my knife. The cab had been rifled through. Glove box open, papers everywhere. The contents of the emergency kit were scattered across the floor. Nothing was stolen, just messed with. I started the truck, turned over fine. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back on the main road. I drove for another hour before I pulled over at a gas station, locked the doors, and sat there just breathing. I stayed at a cheap motel that night. I kept waking up every hour, checking the windows, listening. When I got home, I went through all my gear carefully. Everything was there except the chair and the fabric strip. I checked the GPS data on my phone. No anomalies, no photos, nothing to give me answers. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while. It sounded crazy. I wasn't attacked. Nothing was taken. But someone had been out there, watching, following, messing with my things. And I still don't know why. Eventually, I reported it to the Forest Service, just to have it on record. They didn't find anything. No known squatters in that area. No other reports. Just me. That trip cured me of my love for remote solo camping. I still hike. I still camp sometimes. But not alone. And not that far out. Because the scariest thing out in the wild isn't the bears or the weather or getting lost. It's the people who hide out there, away from the world, doing God knows what, and the fact that you'll probably never know they were even there until it's too late. I had been looking forward to getting away for a while. The year had been long, and I felt like I hadn't had a moment to myself in months. Work was draining, and even though I lived alone in a small apartment in downtown Louisville, I felt crowded all the time. The city had started to feel like it was closing in on me. Sirens every night, crowded sidewalks, loud neighbors, the constant noise from traffic. I missed silence. I missed the woods. I grew up hiking and camping with my dad in southern Indiana, not far from Hoosier National Forest. When I was younger, we used to go out every summer. Nothing fancy, just a tent, some simple meals, and a few days away from everything. My dad passed away 4 years ago, and I hadn't gone camping since. But something in me was itching for it again. I wanted the quiet, the smell of pine needles, the sound of wind pushing through the trees. I wanted to feel small in the middle of nowhere. So in late October of 2023, I cleared a long weekend and packed up. I decided to go to a lesser-known spot just outside the main trail system, about 30 miles east of Tell City. It wasn't an official campground, just a remote area I had bookmarked on an old map. I remembered my dad pointing it out once and saying, "There's a good place to disappear for a while." That stuck with me. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I had mentioned to a coworker that I was taking a camping trip, but I didn't give details. I wasn't trying to be mysterious. I just didn't think it mattered. I had a reliable truck, a well-stocked pack, and years of experience. I figured I'd be fine. I left early on a Friday morning. The air was cool and dry. The trees were already halfway bare, and the roads were quiet. I took a few back roads, winding through small towns and open fields until the pavement gave way to dirt and gravel. After about an hour of driving through the forest, I pulled over at a clearing that looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. The ground was soft, covered in dry leaves and pine needles. Felt perfect. I parked the truck off the trail out of sight and hoisted my pack over my shoulders. I hiked in about 2 miles, deeper into the woods, until I found a flat area near a stream. It wasn't visible from any trail, and the trees were thick enough to keep me hidden. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started to settle in. The first day was peaceful. I spent most of it walking along the stream, taking pictures of the trees and sky. I made a small fire that evening, ate some jerky and dried fruit, and sat quietly until the stars came out. It was cold, but not freezing. I bundled up in my sleeping bag and fell asleep to the sound of water moving slowly over rocks. The second day started just as calm. I woke up with the sun and made some coffee on my little camp stove. I planned to hike a wide loop around the area, just exploring and seeing what I could find. The air was colder that morning, and I noticed a thin layer of frost on the leaves. I had gloves and a warm jacket, so it didn't bother me much. I brought a day pack with some food, water, and a knife, and I started walking. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something strange. There was a cut tree stump, but not an old one, fresh. The wood was still light and clean, and there were sawdust flakes on the ground. That didn't sit right with me. I wasn't anywhere near a logging area, and this tree wasn't along any marked trail. It was tucked into a thicket, surrounded by underbrush. The cut was clean, too clean to be done with an axe. It looked like it had been done with a chainsaw recently. I didn't see any tire tracks or signs of a vehicle. That puzzled me, but I brushed it off. Maybe a hunter clearing a line of sight. I kept walking. Then I found another one, about 50 yards away. Same thing, fresh stump, clean cut, no signs of equipment nearby. I felt the first hint of unease then. The woods are usually filled with signs of life. Squirrels rustling in the brush, birds calling out, branches cracking in the wind. But the air felt still, too still. I stopped and listened. Nothing. No breeze, no birds, not even the sound of the stream in the distance. I decided to circle back to camp, sticking to a different route. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but something in my chest felt tight. I kept scanning the woods around me, looking for movement, but everything was still. When I got back to camp, something was off. My tent was there, but my firewood pile was gone. Completely gone. Not scattered or kicked over, just gone. I know I had stacked it carefully beside a large rock the night before. There were drag marks in the dirt, leading away from the site. They stopped after a few feet and vanished into the underbrush. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty spot. It didn't make sense. An animal might mess with food or dig through trash, but firewood? And there was no sign of the bag I kept it in. I checked my pack. Nothing was missing. The tent was still zipped. No signs of a break-in, but I felt watched. I felt it like pressure on my back. I stayed close to camp for the rest of the day. I didn't light a fire. I sat with my back to a tree, knife in hand, listening to the forest. Still no birds. Still no breeze. just the occasional creak of branches high above me. As the sun started to go down, the temperature dropped quickly. I crawled into the tent early and zipped up tight. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds, soft footsteps, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Every time I unzipped the tent and looked outside, there was nothing. I started to think I was imagining things, but the sounds came from different directions every time. Once I heard a sharp crack, like a branch being broken in half nearby. My heart pounded for hours. I kept my knife beside me, gripped tight, eyes wide in the dark. Morning came slow. I hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time. My hands were stiff from holding the knife. I made a quick decision. I was going to pack up and leave. Something wasn't right. Whether it was a person, an animal, or just the woods playing tricks on me, I didn't want to find out. I started packing, and that's when I saw the first boot print. It wasn't mine. It was larger and deeper, pointing toward my tent. I followed them carefully. There were 3, maybe 4 prints, spaced out in a way that suggested slow, deliberate walking. They disappeared into the undergrowth. That was enough. I packed everything fast, tossing gear into my bag without caring about the order. I didn't eat, didn't stop, just hiked straight back toward the truck. My body was on high alert the entire way. Every sound made me jump. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone there. When I reached the truck, my stomach dropped. There were smudges on the driver's side window, greasy, vague fingerprints. The door was still locked, but I could tell someone had been there. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the back, and started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement. I made it home by late afternoon. I parked in the garage, locked every door, and didn't unpack until the next day. For the next week, I barely slept. I kept the lights on at night. I kept checking the windows. I told myself it was just a random hunter, maybe someone living off-grid who didn't like visitors. But that didn't explain the firewood, the boot prints, the way the forest went silent. 3 weeks later, I saw something on the local news, a missing persons report. A man named Gary Nolan, age 41, last seen camping in Hoosier National Forest. They found his truck parked off a fire road not far from where I had been. That hit me like a punch to the chest. No signs of a struggle, no sign of where he went. Just disappeared. That was the last time I went camping alone. I still hike sometimes, but I stay on the main trails. I tell people exactly where I'm going. I carry a GPS tracker now, and I never sleep in the woods without a locked vehicle nearby. There was no ghost out there, no monster, just something or someone that knew the forest better than I did. Someone who moved through it without sound. Someone who watched. I think about it every time I close my eyes in a quiet room. The way the woods went silent. The way something changed around me. I was lucky. I got out. But someone else didn't. I was 34 when I took the trip. It was late October 2021. My name is Brian Mercer. I'm a freelance photographer, mostly doing work for real estate and nature magazines. I'd been living in Spokane, Washington for a few years by then, and I'd gotten into a habit of doing solo trips out to remote places whenever I felt burned out from editing and deadlines. That year, the burnout hit harder than usual. I had just wrapped up back-to-back contracts for 3 real estate firms and had barely stepped outside in weeks. I found the cabin listing on a website that hosts lesser-known rentals, especially off-grid types. It wasn't Airbnb, more niche. The place was on private land near Coldwater Lake, just southwest of Mount St. Helens. It was advertised as a true solitude experience, with no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no neighbors for miles. The listing said it had solar panels for basic power and a well with a hand pump. The owner, a guy named Dennis, had a bunch of reviews from people who stayed there over the years. No red flags. I booked it for 6 nights. I left Spokane early on a Sunday morning. The drive took me about 6 hours with a few stops for gas and food. By the time I got close to the property, the road had narrowed to a winding gravel trail lined with tall pines. The elevation increased gradually, and the air turned crisp. I rolled down the window and took it in. It smelled like wet bark and dry leaves. My favorite kind of air. The last part of the road was barely a road at all. just two narrow tire paths in the dirt. I followed the email directions exactly, past an old metal gate left open, and finally saw the cabin tucked between two steep ridges, maybe 100 yards back from the lake's edge. It was surrounded by evergreens on all sides, dense and dark, except in one direction where the water reflected the pale gray sky. The cabin itself was older than I expected, but solid. A-frame style with a small front porch, weathered wooden siding, and a metal chimney poking through the top. There was a steel fire pit off to the side with a few damp logs stacked nearby. Everything looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. That was fine with me. I wanted quiet, and that's what I got. Inside, the cabin had a single room with a loft above. The main floor had a wood stove, a cot with thick wool blankets, a table with two chairs, and a small kitchen with a propane stove and a hand-pumped sink. The fridge was a cooler box that drained into a bucket. No plumbing, no thermostat, no insulation. Just wood, nails, and space. The loft had a thin mattress and a dusty window that looked out toward the ridge. By the time I got settled and stacked my camera gear by the table, it was late afternoon. I didn't feel like shooting anything yet. I took a walk down to the lake instead, watching the clouds drift low over the water. The silence out there was heavier than I expected. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence where your ears ring and you notice every movement in the trees. I stood there for a while, letting the calm dig into me. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the wood stove, heated some canned soup, and read a paperback until the warmth made me drowsy. I slept in the loft. The mattress was stiff and smelled like old pine, but I was tired enough not to care. I fell asleep to the sound of wind brushing against the siding. The second day, I started shooting. I walked the perimeter of the lake with my camera, stopping to photograph moss-covered stumps, ripples in the water, and clusters of red and gold leaves still clinging to their branches. I didn't see another person all day, not even a distant boat or a parked truck. It was total isolation. I liked it. That night, I was sitting outside by the fire pit around 8 p.m. I hadn't used it yet, just sitting on the edge with a headlamp on, editing photos on my laptop until the battery died. The temperature had dropped fast after sundown. My breath came out in little clouds. The trees around the clearing were black outlines now. I remember hearing something then, not close, not loud, but definitely out of place. It was a faint metallic clink, like a tool knocking against another, maybe a hammer or wrench. It came from somewhere up the ridge behind the cabin. I looked up instinctively, but all I saw was darkness. The ridge rose sharply about 150 feet behind the cabin and disappeared into heavy forest. No trails up that way, at least not marked ones. I listened for a while, but the sound didn't repeat. I told myself it was nothing. Could have been a branch falling onto a rock or something shifting in the cold. That area used to have logging operations decades ago. Maybe old junk was still up there. I turned in early that night, a little uneasy, but not enough to ruin the trip. The next day, I shot more photos in the opposite direction, trying to get a better angle on the ridge and the lake. I didn't think much about the noise from the night before until I found something strange while hiking back. About 30 yards uphill behind the cabin, I saw a narrow indentation in the ground, mostly covered by ferns and rotting leaves. It wasn't a trail exactly, but it looked like something had been regularly moving through there, flattening the plants in a straight line up the slope. Curious, I followed it for maybe 10 minutes until the incline got too steep and the brush too thick. I didn't find anything obvious. No shack, no campsite, nothing fresh. Still, the track was odd. Too narrow and too consistent to be an animal trail. It looked methodical. I made a mental note and turned back. That night, the sound came again. Same metallic clinking, same location. This time it lasted longer, maybe 5 or 6 faint taps in a row. I froze on the porch, ears straining. Then silence again. No footsteps, no voices, just that strange sound echoing off the trees and then nothing. I didn't sleep well. My brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was camping illegally on the ridge. Maybe a hunter was setting up a blind. Maybe it was just old junk shifting as the temperature dropped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was up there moving around. watching, maybe. On the fourth day, I hiked around the ridge, trying to come at it from the west side where the incline wasn't so bad. I had my camera, a knife, and a pair of binoculars. I wasn't looking for trouble, just answers. The forest was dense, and the terrain rough. Fallen logs, thorny bushes, and loose rocks made it slow going. About halfway up, I found something that made my stomach flip. It was a tree, or rather, what someone had done to it. The trunk had been shaved flat on one side, and into the exposed wood, someone had carved dozens of straight lines, all parallel, all perfectly spaced. They weren't words or symbols, just lines. Rows and rows of them like tally marks but with no grouping. It must have taken hours. The bark shavings were still on the ground, pale and curling. It was recent. I backed off, suddenly aware of how quiet the woods were again. No birds, no insects, just wind and leaves. I didn't go higher. I turned around and got back to the cabin before dark. That night I stayed inside, locked the door, even though the listing had said there was no real need for it. I kept the fire small and the lights off. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside, slow, deliberate, crunching the rocks softly, like someone trying not to be noticed. They circled the cabin once, then nothing. I waited, clutching my knife, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't go to the window. I didn't want to see. By dawn, the footsteps were gone. No knock, no attempt to break in. Just a slow, quiet circle and silence. When I finally stepped outside that morning, I found one thing out of place. A single boot print, deep and wide, in the soft dirt behind the cabin. Too big to be mine, too fresh to be old. That was the turning point. I packed my gear and loaded the car. I didn't care if I had 2 nights left. I was done. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The battery was dead. I tried again. Nothing. Not even a click. I popped the hood, checked the cables, everything looked fine. No obvious damage. I walked back to the cabin and tried to calm down. I didn't have cell service. The nearest road was a 2-hour hike downhill. I had enough food and water, but the idea of staying another night after what I'd seen, what I'd heard, was unbearable. I decided to hike out. I packed a bag with essentials, left a note in case someone found the cabin, and locked up. I left around 10 a.m., following the gravel path back down the hill. About an hour into the hike, I heard something behind me. Not close, not loud, just the unmistakable sound of footsteps on dry leaves. I stopped. They stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then I started walking again. They followed. This continued for almost a mile. Every time I stopped, the sound stopped. When I moved, it resumed, always at the edge of hearing. I never saw anyone. The forest was too thick. By the time I reached the gate at the bottom of the property, the sounds had stopped. The rest of the way to the highway was My name is Darren Collins. I'm 32 now, but this happened when I was 28, back in late September of 2020. I remember the exact date, September 26th, because it was a Saturday, and I had taken the Friday off to get a long weekend out in the woods. I lived in Spokane, Washington at the time, working as a delivery truck driver, and had gotten used to early mornings, quiet roads, and long stretches of time alone. So camping solo wasn't anything strange for me. In fact, I preferred it that way. The spot I chose was in the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, about a 3-hour drive from Spokane if you count the winding dirt roads. It's a massive area. Tons of people go there for hiking, hunting, and camping. But if you drive in far enough and step off the main trail, you can easily go days without seeing another person. That was the plan. Just me, my pack, my tent, and the stillness of the forest. I brought everything I needed: a 4-day supply of food, water purification tablets, a sturdy 2-person tent, which is roomier when you're solo, my knife, a small hatchet, my jet boil for making coffee and quick meals, and a weatherproof duffel for my clothes and gear. I also had a Garmin InReach Mini just in case. I don't mess around when it comes to safety, even if I'm going out alone. I parked the truck at a dead-end spur trail, locked it up, and hiked in about 6 miles off the main road. My final campsite was on a slight rise near a shallow stream, surrounded by dense trees on 3 sides. From that little hill, I could look out through the trees to a wide clearing below, a rocky meadow with patchy grass and fallen logs. There were no signs of anyone having camped there recently. No fire pits, no trash, nothing. It felt untouched. I liked that. I spent the first evening setting up my tent, gathering deadfall for a small campfire, and boiling some water for instant ramen. The air smelled like pine and moss, and the temperature was dropping faster than I expected. I had my layers, so I wasn't worried, but I zipped into my sleeping bag early that night and fell asleep to the sound of the stream trickling down the rocks. The first full day was peaceful. I hiked about 3 miles north of camp, just exploring. Saw some elk tracks, spotted a fox, and startled a couple of grouse. I didn't see another human the whole day. The sun stayed out, and by the time I got back to camp in the early afternoon, I was looking forward to a quiet evening. I cooked a freeze-dried meal and watched the sun go down through the trees. Around dusk, I thought I heard something off in the distance. Not an animal, not natural. It was a sharp sound, rhythmic, almost like metal clinking, but it was faint and far off, maybe across the meadow or farther. I stood still for a long time trying to catch it again, but it stopped. I chalked it up to wind or maybe some animal stepping on an old bit of junk left behind by hunters or hikers years ago. You can still find rusted cans and broken tools out in these woods if you look hard enough. I didn't think too much of it. That night, I lay awake a little longer than usual, listening. But the forest went quiet. Just the usual creaks of trees, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. The second day is when things started to get strange. I woke up around 6. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but there was enough light to see the outline of the trees through the mesh of my tent. I sat up in my sleeping bag, stretched, and unzipped the tent to let in the cold morning air. That's when I noticed something that didn't sit right. On the edge of the clearing, down at the bottom of the hill where the tree line began again, there was something on the ground. It was dark, maybe a stump or a pile of something, but I hadn't seen it the day before. I pulled out my little binoculars from my pack and took a look. It wasn't a stump. It looked like a bundle of fabric, maybe a jacket or a tarp, but it was just laying there about 50 yards away, half in the grass and half in the dirt. It gave me a weird feeling, like something had changed in the night and I hadn't noticed. I thought maybe a hunter had dropped it or left it behind. Still, I didn't feel like walking down to check it out just yet. I made coffee and sat by the fire pit, glancing down at the thing every now and then. It didn't move. By late morning, I gave in to curiosity and hiked down toward it. As I got closer, I could see it was a jacket, a heavy-duty canvas one, dark green, covered in dirt and pine needles like it had been dragged. I poked it with a stick. Nothing underneath it. No bag, no gear, just the jacket. I picked it up carefully and shook it out. No name tag, no wallet, no ID. Just torn lining and a busted zipper. It looked old, but not ancient. A couple years, maybe. I left it where it was and walked a bit farther into the tree line, just scanning for signs of anyone. No footprints, no boot marks, no other gear. After about 10 minutes, I circled back and went up the hill to camp. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. Someone ditched it or lost it, but the forest felt different now, like I wasn't really alone anymore. That night, I didn't make a fire. I just ate a cold meal and stayed quiet, sitting in the tent with the flap unzipped so I could look out into the dark. I didn't use my headlamp much, just tried to let my eyes adjust. It was close to midnight when I heard something again. Not metal this time, not sharp. It was soft, a crunch, then another, then silence. It was footsteps. I know what footsteps sound like in the woods. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I stayed frozen, staring out into the black, waiting. My hand was on my knife, my body stiff. The steps didn't get closer, but they didn't move away either. Then I heard a stick snap. Closer, maybe 30 feet from the tent, off to the right near the cluster of trees. I didn't move. I didn't breathe for what felt like a full minute. Then silence again. Eventually, I clicked on my headlamp and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing, just trunks and darkness. I stepped outside and swept the light around the clearing. No movement, no sounds. The air was freezing. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I walked the edge of the campsite looking for signs. I found 2 faint prints in the dirt by the stream. Big prints. Hiking boots, not wildlife. They were facing the tent. No prints leading away, just those 2. The rest had been wiped out by the frost or leaves. I decided I'd leave a day early. Something wasn't right. I packed my gear in a hurry, took down the tent, and started the long hike back toward the truck. I was about halfway, maybe 3 miles in, when I noticed something that made me stop cold. On a tree about 10 feet off the trail, there was a strip of red cloth tied around the trunk. Bright red, like flagging tape, but it wasn't plastic. It was fabric. Torn shirt, maybe. Another 100 feet down the trail, there was another one. Same height, same kind of fabric. This one had a bit of dirt on it, like it had been dragged. My brain went into overdrive. Was someone marking my route? Had they been following me? I kept walking faster now. Every little sound made me stop and look back. The forest was too quiet. I reached my truck just after noon. Everything looked the same. No damage, no signs of anyone tampering with it. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the back, and got inside. As I turned the key, I felt this overwhelming flood of relief. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until that moment. I drove straight back to Spokane. Didn't stop. Didn't eat. When I got home, I reported what happened to the local ranger station. I told them about the jacket, the footsteps, the prints, the fabric strips. They took it seriously but said it wasn't uncommon to find strange things in the woods. People dump stuff. Hunters get careless. And yeah, sometimes weirdos camp out off-grid. A few days later, I got a call. They'd sent someone to check the area. They found the jacket. They also found more of those red fabric strips, deeper in the woods, all in a pattern. They said it looked like someone had been using them to track movement or mark paths. But no one was there when they searched. No camps, no recent fires, no people. Just markers. The ranger told me I was smart to leave when I did. He didn't say much else. That was almost 5 years ago. I still go camping, but not alone. Not out that far. I stick to areas with cell service and other people nearby. I've learned to trust my gut. When something feels off in the woods, it probably is. What scares me the most is not what I saw. It's what I didn't. Who was out there? What did they want? Why were they marking my path? And why did they stop just short of the tent? I'll never know. But I still think about those footsteps at night, the ones that never came any closer, but never went away either. I was 34 years old when I decided to hike and camp solo for the first time. I had done a fair amount of hiking with friends over the years, mostly on marked trails around Vermont and New Hampshire. But solo camping, that was new for me. I'd recently moved to western Wyoming, and one weekend in late September 2022, I finally decided to stop thinking about it and just go. I'd been looking at Jackson Lake on a map for a while, especially the area north of it, where the hills start to roll into more isolated ridges. I found a less traveled trail that led along the west side of the lake, with several forks that climbed into a remote patch of forest behind a ridge called Fall Creek Butte. Not a lot of people went up there. No campsites, no facilities. That was the draw. The plan was simple. Hike in on Friday morning, set up camp somewhere behind the ridge, stay one night, and hike out Saturday afternoon. I didn't tell too many people, just sent my brother a text with a pin of the general area. I figured cell reception would be weak, so I also wrote down the trail name and left it on the kitchen counter at home. I packed conservatively but thoroughly: tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, food for 2 days, a Jetboil stove, first aid kit, water filter, and extra socks. The forecast was dry and cool. I left just after sunrise Friday and parked at a small gravel turnout by the trailhead. Only one other car was there. The first few hours of hiking went smoothly. The trail was marked but rugged. I saw moose tracks along the edges and heard distant elk bugling, which was pretty surreal. The leaves had just started turning. The higher I climbed, the more orange and red filled the trees. By mid-afternoon, I reached the ridge I had seen on the map, Fall Creek Butte. It wasn't much of a summit, more like a long, uneven hump of rock and soil about 7,500 feet up. Once I was over it, I found a small hollow near a stream to pitch my tent. The water was flowing slow but steady, and the ground was soft but dry. The area felt isolated. No human sounds, no traffic noise, no airplanes, just trees and wind. I set up my tent in a small clearing about 30 yards from the stream. I made sure to hang my food high in a tree, away from the tent. Then I cooked some dehydrated chili and ate while sitting on a rock. The sun dipped behind the trees early. By 7 p.m., it was getting cold. That night was quiet, but I didn't sleep well. Every little sound outside the tent made my body tense. It wasn't fear exactly, just high alert. I heard something rustling near the stream at one point, maybe a deer or raccoon. At one point around 2 a.m., I sat up in my sleeping bag and just listened. Total darkness. Even the moon was low and blocked by trees. Morning brought some relief. I unzipped the tent and felt the cold air rush in. My breath fogged out in front of me. I made some instant coffee and ate a protein bar, then walked a little upstream to refill water. My plan was to explore a nearby rise I'd seen the day before. Looked like a small bluff just west of my camp. I left most of my gear behind and took a small day pack with water, my map, a snack, and my phone. Even though it had no signal, I also carried the bear spray on my hip. The slope up to the bluff was steeper than I expected, and the ground was loose with pine needles and broken twigs. I kept climbing, pulling myself up by tree trunks and roots. When I reached the top, the view was worth it. Through breaks in the trees, I could see Jackson Lake glinting in the distance, and the Tetons far beyond it. I sat for a while, drank some water, and listened. Then I noticed something strange. It was quiet, too quiet. Even for the backcountry, the silence felt unnatural. No birds, no insects, just the wind. That's when I felt something shift in my gut. A pressure like being watched. I told myself I was just being paranoid and started heading back. I took a slightly different path down, thinking it would circle back to the stream. But within 20 minutes, I realized I was off. The slope kept pulling me down farther than I expected, and I wasn't seeing any of the landmarks I recognized. I doubled back but must have angled wrong. My map didn't help much, too zoomed out. I didn't have GPS. I hiked for what felt like an hour trying to reorient, scanning for anything familiar. I finally found the stream again, or so I thought, but something about it felt wrong. It was wider and the bank was more eroded. I followed it anyway, thinking maybe it would eventually lead me to camp. That's when I found the dead elk. It was lying on its side in the shallows, legs twisted unnaturally. The eyes were gone. Its hide had been torn open at the abdomen, ribs exposed. Flies buzzed thick in the air. The thing was fresh, no more than a day old. But what struck me was how clean the wounds were. No drag marks, no scattered fur. It wasn't a bear kill, at least not like the ones I'd seen before. This thing had been opened with precision. I stood there staring for too long. Then I started moving faster. The stream curved and twisted through thicker woods, and the sun had shifted high overhead. I still hadn't found camp. I started shouting, not for help, but just out of frustration. I felt the anxiety bubbling up. I hadn't seen another person in almost 24 hours. I hadn't eaten since morning. Eventually, I made a dumb decision. I dropped my pack to move faster. I kept only my bear spray and phone. I figured I'd come back for it when I found my bearings. That was my second mistake. The first was leaving camp without marking it. The woods began to feel tighter, thicker, like the trees had grown closer together the deeper I went. I wasn't just lost. I was disoriented. I found a rock face I hadn't seen before and realized I had no idea which direction I was heading anymore. The sun was slipping west. Shadows lengthened. That's when I heard it, crackling, not far behind me. A steady crunch of brush. Something was moving. Heavy steps. I froze, bear spray in hand. The steps stopped. I turned slowly and scanned the trees. Nothing, just trees and shadow. I moved again, more quickly now. Over the next half hour, I heard it again. A few times. Always behind me. I'd stop and it would stop. I'd move and it would start again. Always keeping its distance. Whatever it wasn't running. It wasn't crashing through the woods. It was following. By this point, the light was going fast. I hadn't found my pack. I hadn't found camp. I was cold, hungry, and panicking. I finally decided to make a temporary shelter. Found a shallow depression beneath some fallen branches. Cleared it out, built a wall of sticks and dry leaves. No fire. I didn't have anything to start one. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep, just sat there, gripping the bear spray, knees tucked to my chest. The temperature dropped into the 30s. Every hour I'd hear movement, soft, careful, staying just far enough that I couldn't see it. I made it to morning, barely. I stood up, stretched my aching legs, and started walking again. My goal was just to find any sign of trail, anything. I climbed higher ground and spotted a break in the trees. Looked like a rocky outcrop. When I reached it, I could finally see the lake. Far off, but visible. I angled toward it, moving faster now. Took me another 6 hours of hiking, backtracking, and second-guessing before I hit a trail. A real one, packed earth, footprints. I nearly cried when I saw it. I followed it south. By late afternoon, I reached the turnout where my car was still parked. The other car was gone. When I got home that night, I ate until I felt sick and slept for almost 12 hours. I never went back to that ridge. But a few weeks later, I looked up the area on some old hunting forums and backcountry blogs. I wasn't the first to report strange kills near that ridge. Several posts mentioned cleaned carcasses. No drag marks. Sometimes deer, sometimes elk. All in the same hollow near Fall Creek Butte. One post from 2016 stuck with me. A hunter claimed he'd seen a man in full camo watching him from the trees. Silent, just standing. He thought it was a ranger until he realized the man wasn't carrying a rifle, just a long blade. The forest is big, bigger than we think. And not all the dangers in it have claws. Some of them wear boots. It was the fall of 2014 when I decided to take a break from the constant buzz of life in the city. I was 32 at the time, single, and working long hours in IT. My days had become a blur of screens, deadlines, and emails that never stopped coming. I felt burnt out and restless. So when a friend mentioned a cheap rental cabin in the woods upstate, tucked near the edge of Pine Hollow Preserve, I took it as a sign. He'd stayed there once during college and said it was nothing fancy, but peaceful, just what I needed. The cabin was about 3.5 hours from where I lived in Philadelphia. I left early on a Thursday morning to avoid traffic, driving through fading towns and long stretches of empty back roads. As I got further north, the trees thickened and the air turned crisp. I rolled down my window a bit just to take it in. It was early October, and the leaves were starting to turn. Gold, orange, a few patches of bright red. The kind of scenery that looked fake if you saw it in a painting. The directions my friend gave me were pretty straightforward. The cabin was about 40 minutes past the last gas station in a town called Lasker, down a gravel road with no name, just a faded sign nailed to a tree that read Pine Hollow. I found it easily enough. The gravel crackled under my tires, and the road narrowed the deeper I went, trees crowding closer, their branches sometimes brushing the roof of my car. No cell service past Lasker, but I'd expected that. I had a paper map in the glove box just in case. The cabin came into view about a mile in, small, weathered but solid looking. It sat on a slight slope overlooking a long, narrow lake, its surface glassy and unmoving. No neighbors in sight, no other houses, just trees and silence. I parked my car, grabbed my duffel bag, and unlocked the front door with the key my friend mailed me. The place smelled like old wood and dust. It had clearly been a while since anyone stayed there. The main room had a couch, a small kitchen area, and a wood stove. There was one bedroom and a tiny bathroom that had a flush toilet but no shower, just a sink. Water came from a well pump out back. No Wi-Fi, no TV. Power was solar, but there was a backup generator in the shed out back if needed. It was perfect. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, swept out cobwebs, and opened all the windows to air the place out. Made myself a simple dinner on the propane stove, canned soup and crackers, then sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the trees across the lake. The silence was thick, almost alive. Not oppressive, but heavy. A kind of quiet you forget exists when you live around people too long. That night, I slept like a rock. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and the wind moving through the trees. I made instant coffee, sat out on the porch again, and just listened. There were no engines, no people, just nature. I felt my chest loosen for the first time in months. I spent most of the day exploring the area around the cabin. There was a trail that followed the lake's edge, overgrown but walkable. I found a couple of animal tracks in the mud, maybe deer. I took a few photos with my phone, even though I knew I wouldn't be able to upload them until I got back. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I noticed something small but strange. One of the front windows was open. I was sure I'd closed them all earlier, but I figured I'd missed it, shrugged it off, and latched it shut. That night, I built a fire in the wood stove and read a paperback I'd brought. Around 9 p.m., I turned off the lights and climbed into bed. The wind had picked up and the trees groaned a little outside, but otherwise it was calm. I woke up just after 1 a.m. The air was cold. I pulled the blankets tighter and lay still, not sure what had stirred me. Then I heard a faint creak. Not the trees, not the wind. It was sharper, closer. I sat up and listened. Came again, this time more distinct. A floorboard, I thought, shifting. I told myself it was the cabin settling. Old houses do that. But then I heard it again. Not just one creak, but 2, 3 in a row. Like footsteps. I stayed frozen in bed, barely breathing. The cabin had no insulation, and every sound traveled. I strained to hear more, but the noise stopped. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes, heart thumping. Nothing. Just silence again. Eventually, I chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe an animal on the porch. I drifted back to sleep around 3. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I hiked a bit further along the lake, then made a sandwich for lunch. Back at the cabin, I did a slow walk around the outside, just to reassure myself. Nothing seemed out of place, until I looked at the back door. There were scratches along the wood near the handle. Not deep, but definitely there and fresh. Not the kind of weathering you see from age or storms. These were narrow, straight marks, like someone had tried to pick at the lock or pry it open with something thin. My skin crawled. I checked the door. It was locked. Still, I felt unease settle in my stomach like a stone. I told myself again it could have been animals. A raccoon maybe, or a porcupine. But something about the marks seemed deliberate. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept checking the locks. The wind blew harder, and branches tapped against the windows. I left the light on in the bedroom. Just a small one, but enough to cut the dark. I kept the axe I used for chopping firewood next to the bed. I knew it was overkill, but it made me feel better. I fell asleep eventually. I woke again, this time to the unmistakable sound of the front porch boards groaning under weight. Not the wind, not some squirrel, something heavier. I didn't move. I listened, heart racing, to the steady crunch of weight shifting on old wood. Pause. Another step, then another, right outside the door. I waited, barely breathing. Then nothing. Minutes passed. I stayed still. When the sun finally rose, I got up and opened the front door. The porch was empty. No sign of anything. No footprints. But I knew what I'd heard. That was the day I decided to drive into Lasker and buy a set of trail cams. I figured if it was an animal or someone, I'd know for sure. I made the drive, picked up 3 cams, batteries, and a couple of protein bars for good measure. I was gone maybe 3 hours. When I got back, something was off again. The welcome mat was slightly crooked. Not the kind of thing you'd normally notice, but I remembered setting it a certain way that morning, centered. Now it was askew. I checked the locks. Still latched. I installed the cams before sunset. One facing the back door, one overlooking the front porch, and one pointing down the trail leading to the lake. I set them to record movement. That night, I barely slept. The following morning, I checked the footage. Front porch cam, nothing. Back door cam, nothing. Trail cam, movement at 2:17 a.m. I replayed the clip. First, it was just the trees swaying. Then a figure appeared. A man. He stepped into frame slowly, half-crouched, moving with intent. He wore dark clothes, a hood pulled up, and gloves. He moved off trail and toward the trees, heading in the direction of the cabin. But the clip ended before he came close enough to be seen clearly. I watched it a dozen times. I didn't call the police. I should have. But what would I say? That a guy walked near my cabin in the woods? I didn't even have a plate number. And there was no service anyway. I could have driven back into town, but something made me stay. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. I decided I'd give it one more night. Just one. I kept the axe by the bed again, set up a few makeshift noisemakers, tin cans strung with fishing line, across the porch and near the back. Anything to give me a heads up. That night, it was quiet for hours. Then the cans rattled. Not a gust, not a bump. They rattled. I jumped up, turned on every light in the cabin, and stepped to the door with the axe in hand. I didn't open it, just stood there, heart hammering, listening. Footsteps again. This time, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun rose, I went out. The cans had been tripped, the line pulled taut. Boot prints in the dirt. Size 11 maybe, fresh, leading around the cabin. Then veering off into the trees. I packed my things, left the cams where they were. I drove out of Pine Hollow without looking back, heart still pounding hours later. 2 days later, I got a call from my friend, the one who recommended the cabin. He told me to check the footage when I got home. He'd seen something on the news. A man had been arrested in a town 30 miles from Pine Hollow. They found him squatting in a hunting shack. He had tools, gloves, and a long record breaking and entering, stalking, assault. No one had known he was in the woods. No one had seen him until he tried to break into a ranger station during the night. I checked the footage again. It was him. Same build, same clothes. I was lucky. He never got. My name's Mason. Back in 2017, I was 28 years old and stuck in a rut I didn't see coming. I just quit my job in Boston. Some marketing gig that paid well but had me staring at screens for 12 hours a day. My girlfriend had left a few months earlier. Said I was distant. Said I was becoming someone she didn't recognize. She was right. That fall, I started to spiral. I drank more, slept during the day, ignored friends, ignored bills. When winter hit, I realized I needed to get out of the city, somewhere cold and quiet. Just me, no distractions. I found a place on an old forum. Somebody was renting out a remote cabin in northern Vermont for cheap. Guy said it had wood heat, a basic kitchen, no Wi-Fi, no cell reception. Sounded perfect. The drive took most of the day. Snow had started falling just north of Montpelier, and by the time I hit the turnoff near a town called Craftsbury, visibility was getting bad. The GPS on my old Subaru gave out 10 miles past the last gas station. I followed the directions I'd printed off, winding through back roads lined with leafless trees and snow-covered stone walls. Every few miles I passed an old barn or a rundown farmhouse, but mostly it was just woods. Dark, wet woods that closed in on both sides like a tunnel. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that curved downhill through a birch grove. It looked smaller than I'd expected, single-story, weathered cedar planks, a rusted metal chimney poking out from the roof. There was a small woodshed to the side and a frozen creek just down the slope. The place had a tilted porch with one broken step and a screen door hanging by one hinge. Inside, it was dark and cold. The front room was one big open space with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen tucked into the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and an old couch that looked like it had seen better decades. A hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. The air smelled like mildew and wood smoke. A few spider webs hung in the corners. I lit a fire first thing. Took forever to get going. The logs in the shed were damp and half-rotted, but after enough newspaper and frustration, the flames finally caught. I unpacked my gear, just a duffel bag with clothes, a box of canned food, a few bottles of water, and a flask I'd filled with bourbon for emergencies. I set up my laptop even though there was no Wi-Fi, just to journal or watch movies I'd downloaded. But mostly I planned to read, right? Maybe go hiking once the weather cleared. The first night was peaceful. I remember that. The fire popped quietly, and snow tapped at the windows like tiny fingers. It was the kind of quiet that made you realize how loud cities were. No cars, no people yelling, just wind and trees. I slept well under a pile of old quilts I found in the bedroom closet. But the peace didn't last. It started the second night. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. Not a crash or bang, just this slow, rhythmic creaking, like someone walking in circles on the porch. I sat up, heart thudding, and held my breath. Kept going, a step every few seconds. Would groaning under weight. It stopped after a minute. I figured maybe it was a deer, or the wind shifting the porch boards. Still, I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I saw footprints in the snow outside the front door. Human ones, boot prints. They circled the cabin once and disappeared back into the woods. They weren't mine. I'd stayed inside all day. They were spaced far apart, like the person was tall or walking fast. I told myself it was probably a local hunter. Maybe someone checking out the place, thinking it was empty. The guy I rented from hadn't mentioned neighbors, but I hadn't asked either. Still, the sight of those tracks, fresh and clear, made the skin on my neck prickle. I spent the day chopping some of the dryer wood I found at the bottom of the stack. I tried to distract myself with reading, cooking, and writing nonsense in my journal. But every sound outside made me twitch. The wind in the trees, branches falling, snow shifting on the roof. I didn't sleep that night either. The third night, something woke me again. This time it was a scrape, like metal on wood. Came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. I sat up on the couch, where I'd been dozing with the fire dying out. The sound came again. Scrape, pause, scrape. I crept into the kitchen and looked out the back window. Nothing but darkness and trees. In the morning, I found more tracks. This time, they led from the creek up to the back of the house. Someone had walked right up to the rear wall and just stood there. No boot prints leading away, just a set of them straight to the wall and nothing else. I tried to convince myself they'd been covered by snowfall, but I knew better. The snow was light, barely an inch. No way it erased footprints that quickly. That afternoon, I dragged an old dresser in front of the back door. I wedged a chair under the knob for good measure. I didn't own a gun, but I did have a hunting knife and a hammer, which I kept near me at all times after that. I didn't want to leave early. I told myself I was overreacting, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just the tracks. It was a feeling, like I was being watched. On the fourth night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the fire with the lights off, wrapped in a blanket, eyes on the windows. Around 3 a.m., I saw movement. Just a flicker, a shape moving past the front window. I froze, didn't breathe. A few seconds later, I heard a soft thud on the porch. Then that same creaking again. One step, pause, another step. Whoever it was stopped right in front of the door. Then silence. I sat there for what felt like an hour. Never moved, never blinked. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. In the morning, I found the snow on the porch disturbed, like someone had stood there a long time, shuffling their feet. The footprints led down the hill toward the trees. I followed them for about 50 feet before they disappeared into the underbrush. No sign of who made them. That day, I almost left. I packed my bag, threw everything into the car, and started it up. But the engine made a weird grinding noise and then died. I tried again. Nothing. Battery was fine. Fuel gauge said I had a quarter tank, but it wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood. Everything looked normal, but I'm no mechanic. I went back inside, heart sinking. I kept the fire going all day and tried not to panic. That night, I left the lights on. Every single one. I sat with the hammer in my lap, barely blinking. No movement, no sounds. But the next morning, I found something new. On the porch railing, someone had scratched a message into the wood. Just 2 words, "Stay inside." I stared at it for a long time. My hands were shaking. I knew I had to leave. I didn't care if I had to hike out. I packed everything into my bag and started walking down the road toward where I came from. But after a mile or so, I saw something that made me stop. My tire tracks, the ones I'd made driving in, were gone. Covered, but not by snow. Someone had raked the snow smooth, like they didn't want anyone to find the cabin. I turned back. I didn't know what else to do. I was in the middle of nowhere with no phone, no working car, no idea who was out there. I figured it'd be safer to stay inside during the day and only hike out once I had a solid plan. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard banging at the back door. Not knocking, banging, like someone slamming their fists into the wood over and over. The chair wedged under the knob held, but the whole door shook. I grabbed the hammer and stood there, heart racing, not breathing. After a minute, the banging stopped. Then I heard footsteps running around the side of the cabin. I sprinted to the front door just in time to see someone disappear into the woods. Tall, wearing dark clothes, moving fast. I didn't sleep. I didn't even sit down. I waited for daylight, then moved the dresser away, grabbed my pack, and started walking again. This time I followed the creek downstream, thinking it might lead to a road. It took me half the day, but eventually I came out near a dirt road with tire tracks. Real ones, fresh. I followed them until I saw a mailbox and an old farmhouse. The man who lived there called the sheriff for me. He was quiet, looked at me strange when I told him where I'd been, said that cabin hadn't been rented out in years. Said the owner, a guy named Harrow, had died 2 winters ago. The sheriff came, asked me a few questions, then drove me back to the cabin to check things out. It was empty, no footprints, no scratches on the railing, nothing disturbed, but my car still wouldn't start. Sheriff had it towed to town. Turns out someone had pulled out a few spark plug wires. Deliberately, they never found who did it. I didn't stay the night in town. I rented a car and drove straight back to Boston. That was 8 years ago. I haven't gone camping since. Haven't stepped foot in Vermont either. I think about it a lot, who was out there, why they didn't break in, what they meant by stay inside. I don't have answers. Just the memory of a cold, It was the summer of 2012, a year I'll never forget. I was 24 at the time, living in a small town in Oregon, far away from the busy city life I had grown tired of. I needed an escape, something to clear my mind after a tough few months of work and stress. So when a buddy of mine, Ryan, suggested a weekend camping trip, I jumped at the idea. It was just supposed to be a quick getaway, a chance to get out into the woods and disconnect from everything. I never could have imagined how the trip would change me. We decided to head to a place called Clear Creek, a remote camping spot deep in the Oregon Cascades. The place was known for its tranquility, a few scattered cabins along the creek, and lots of thick forest. No cell service, no distractions, just us and nature. That's what I thought, at least. We packed up our gear, set out from town around 4 p.m., and arrived at the campsite just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The drive had been peaceful, winding through old pines and past fast-moving rivers. I remember the air feeling cool, even though it was late spring, and the scent of pine and damp earth filling the car. We didn't see many other vehicles on the road, just the occasional truck, and that added to the sense of isolation. By the time we arrived, the camp was quiet, too quiet almost. It wasn't exactly the type of place where people camped in large groups. There was no campsite manager or rangers patrolling the area. It was just an open forest with a few cleared areas and fire rings. Ryan and I found a spot near the creek, far from the few cabins that dotted the land. The site was small, but it had a perfect view of the water. We set up our tent and fire pit, grabbed some firewood, and got the flames going. As night fell, the forest around us seemed to come alive. The distant calls of animals, the rustling of leaves in the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot filled the air. It was peaceful, but there was something about the isolation that felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up every now and then. We spent the first few hours talking, roasting marshmallows, and drinking some beers. I tried to push away the odd feeling I had, but it kept creeping up. After a while, the conversation lulled, and we both sat there in silence, staring into the fire. The flames flickered, and I watched as they cast long shadows on the trees surrounding us. The fire felt like a barrier between us and whatever was out there in the dark. It was around midnight when the noises started. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal moving through the woods. But as the sounds grew more distinct, I started to feel uneasy. There was something out there. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the underbrush, followed by something that sounded like branches snapping. Ryan noticed it too. He looked at me, his face pale in the firelight. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, my eyes scanning the darkness. "Yeah, sounds like someone's walking out there." We both stood up, our eyes locked on the thick woods beyond the firelight. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling in the trees. I don't know why, but I felt like someone or something was watching us. I kept expecting to see a figure emerge from the shadows, but nothing did. The silence grew heavy, and we stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting. Then, without warning, a large crash came from the forest, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the brush. Ryan and I both jumped back, hearts racing. The noise came from just beyond the tree line, too close for comfort. My first instinct was to grab the flashlight, but I didn't want to give away our position if it was someone trying to sneak up on us. We just stood there, frozen. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an age, the sound of movement finally stopped. I don't know how long it lasted, but when it was over, the forest went silent again. The kind of silence that felt unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting for us to make the wrong move. Ryan and I exchanged a look, and without saying a word, we both agreed that it was time to go inside the tent. We quickly doused the fire, grabbed our things, and zipped up the tent, leaving the outside world behind. Inside, the temperature dropped, and the shadows cast by our headlamps danced on the walls of the tent. We tried to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease that had settled in our stomachs. There was no talking about what had happened. We just lay there, staring into the darkness, listening for any more sounds from outside. As the hours ticked by, I could hear Ryan's breathing slow down, his deep sleep settling in. But I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, replaying every little sound I had heard. I kept picturing someone, moving outside the tent, waiting for the right moment. Felt like we were being hunted, like we weren't alone. Eventually, around 3 a.m., the sounds returned. I heard them faintly at first. More twigs snapping, more rustling, but this time it was closer, much closer. It was as if whatever it was circling us, moving through the underbrush just beyond our tent. The sound of something heavy scraping against the ground sent a shiver down my spine. My breath hitched in my throat as I strained my ears, trying to figure out what was out there. Then, there was a new sound, something that froze my blood in my veins. A whisper, a soft voice. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, clearer this time. It was low, unintelligible, but it was unmistakable. A voice coming from the direction of the trees. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as my mind raced. Who would be out there at this time of night? Why weren't they speaking clearly? Was someone trying to mess with us? I kept telling myself it had to be a prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something about the way the voice came through, the way the sound echoed off the trees. It didn't feel right. I shook Ryan awake, my voice hoarse from fear. He stirred but didn't fully wake up. I grabbed his arm, shaking him harder. "Ryan, wake up, something's out there." He groggily opened his eyes, his face still half turned towards the darkness outside the tent. "What? You're freaking me out." "No, listen," I whispered, my voice shaking. "There's someone out there. We both lay still, the tent trembling slightly in the wind, straining to hear. The whispering grew louder, closer. It was like someone was right outside the tent now, speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Ryan finally sat up, wide awake now. Okay, this isn't funny. We need to get out of here. I felt my pulse quicken. Do you have a weapon? A knife? Anything? Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his backpack and pulled out a small pocket knife, his hands trembling. I did the same, my fingers fumbling as I unsheathed my own knife. We sat there, listening to the voice grow louder and more frantic. The whispers had turned into incoherent murmurs, but it was clear something was wrong. We couldn't stay here any longer. We carefully unzipped the tent, trying not to make a sound. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. The forest outside was unnervingly quiet. There was no movement, no sound except for the distant hum of the wind. I peered into the darkness, but all I saw was the blackness of the trees, their silhouettes twisted by the faint light of the moon. Let's go. Now, Ryan hissed. We didn't need any more encouragement. We grabbed our bags and ran. We didn't know where we were going or how far we had to go to get away from whatever was out there, but we couldn't stay any longer. The forest felt like it was closing in around us, the trees like dark figures watching us. It wasn't until we reached the edge of the creek that we stopped, gasping for breath, our legs aching from the sprint. The only sound was the rushing water. We stood there for a few moments, not saying a word, just trying to catch our breath. After a while, we looked at each other, our faces pale with fear. We weren't alone out there, but whatever it was, whatever had been following us, whispering in the dark, it was gone. For now, we didn't go back to that campsite. In fact, we didn't go back to Clear Creek at all. The next day, we packed up and left as quickly as we could, the events of that night haunting us both. We couldn't explain what happened. There were no signs of anyone out there, no footprints, no broken branches, just the feeling of being hunted, of being watched. We never spoke about it again. Years later, I found myself back in Oregon, this time with my wife and kids. We were on a road trip through the Cascades when we passed by Clear Creek. I had to stop and take a look. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could find some kind of closure. But when I got there, the place was different. The trees were taller, the creek quieter, but there was an odd stillness in the air. And when I looked down the path leading to the camping site, I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure standing at the edge of the forest. I had just turned 34 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was working as a freelance photographer in Charlotte, North Carolina, and life had become one long loop of deadlines, gigs, and tired evenings staring at my laptop. My back hurt more than it should for someone my age, my sleep was off, and I'd started drinking way too much coffee just to feel like I was awake. I needed a reset, not a vacation with people or resorts or a tight schedule, but just time alone. It was mid-September 2023, and the air had that first crisp edge that hinted fall was coming. I went on a rental site and found a small cabin near the Pisgah National Forest. It wasn't far from Asheville, maybe a 2-hour drive. The cabin was owned by an older couple who lived about 15 minutes away, but the place itself was secluded, tucked behind a gravel road that split off from a mostly unused county road. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no neighbors in sight. Perfect. I packed a few essentials: a cooler with food, a small bag of clothes, my camera, a flashlight, and a book I hadn't touched in months. I even brought my dog, Toby, a 5-year-old golden retriever who had more energy than I ever did, even on my best days. I figured it'd be good for both of us. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I'd be gone for a few days and needed some space. I arrived at the cabin late afternoon on a Friday. The road up to it was rough, filled with potholes and patches of moss that made my tires slip a little. Trees leaned in over the path, thick with green leaves just starting to curl yellow. The cabin itself was older than the photos made it look, with wooden siding that had turned gray from the weather and a front porch that sagged a little in the middle. Still, it felt solid, real, like it had seen years of storms and silence. Inside, the cabin was simple. One bedroom, a tiny kitchen with a gas stove, a living area with a wood-burning stove, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of pine cleaner and mildew. The windows were streaked with rainwater stains and dead bugs sat in the corners of the sills. I didn't mind. It felt like a place that had been left alone, and I wanted that kind of peace. That first night, I made a small fire in the stove, opened a beer, and sat on the creaky porch while Toby sniffed every inch of grass around us. He was loving it. His tail didn't stop wagging for hours. I watched the sun drop behind the hills, and when the stars came out, I realized just how quiet it was. Not city quiet, real quiet. No humming appliances, no sirens in the distance, not even the sound of passing cars. Just wind moving through trees and the occasional crack of a branch under some animal's foot. I slept hard that night. No dreams, no waking up to check the time, just deep rest like I hadn't felt in months. I woke to the sound of Toby pacing by the door. When I let him out, he bolted into the woods, barking at something I couldn't see, probably a rabbit or a squirrel. I gave him a few minutes before calling him back, and eventually he came running with his tongue out, proud like he'd accomplished something. The day passed slowly. I read a few chapters, took a walk down a small trail behind the cabin, and tried to take some photos, but my head wasn't in it. I was too focused on trying to slow down to actually be where I was. That night, I made some canned chili, fed Toby, and sat outside again as the sky went dark. That's when I first noticed something strange. Toby was restless. He kept looking toward the tree line, ears up, tail stiff. I thought maybe it was a deer or a coyote, so I called him inside, locked the door, and tried to ignore it. But around midnight, I woke up again. Toby was at the window growling low. Not barking, just this deep, slow growl like something was out there. I sat up and listened. At first, I heard nothing, but then there was a soft sound, branches snapping, not far from the window. Not the wind, something walking, something bigger than a rabbit. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and peeked through the curtain. The light was weak, but I caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the trees. The figure, human. They ducked quickly behind a trunk when the light hit them. I stood there frozen, flashlight shaking in my hand. I told myself it was a hiker who got lost, someone camping nearby, but they were watching the cabin. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat on the couch with the flashlight in my lap. Toby curled next to me, still alert. Every so often, I'd hear more footsteps, slower now, circling. The cabin had no locks on the windows, just simple latches. I checked each one, made sure they were shut tight. I didn't have a weapon, just a rusty hatchet I found near the woodpile out back. I brought it inside. By morning, whoever it was had gone, or at least I didn't see them. The forest looked normal again, but something had shifted. That calm I came for was gone. I made coffee, hands still trembling a little, and sat on the porch with Toby by my feet. I looked for footprints, broken branches, anything that showed someone had been there. I found some marks in the dirt near the back corner of the cabin. Could have been animal tracks, but they were too clean. A heel print, partial tread from a boot. Someone had been there, watching. I thought about packing up, going home early, but I convinced myself it was probably just some camper who stumbled across the cabin and didn't want to scare me. I left a note in the window that said, "Private property. Leaving soon." I hoped it would do the trick. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't walk the trail, didn't wander. I kept the hatchet nearby and the flashlight in my pocket. Toby stayed close too, which was unusual for him. He liked to explore. That night, I brought him in early, locked everything up again, and sat by the fire with my book. Tried to read. I kept glancing at the windows. Around 10 p.m., the power went out. The cabin didn't have much power to begin with, just a couple of lights run off an old generator, and no cell reception meant no way to call for help. I grabbed the flashlight and stood in the middle of the room, every nerve in my body on edge. Toby was barking now, pacing again. I moved to the front window and shined the light outside. Standing at the tree line about 20 feet from the porch was a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, arms at his sides, staring at the cabin. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I knew he saw me. I yelled, but the sound got swallowed by the woods. I turned on the flashlight's strobe setting and flashed it toward him, hoping it would scare him off. He didn't move. I ran to the door and locked the deadbolt, backed away, and waited. After 5 minutes, I checked the window again. He was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat with the hatchet in my lap. Every light I could get running on batteries switched on. Toby was glued to my side, ears perked. The sounds outside didn't stop. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, something brushing against the siding of the cabin. Whoever it was, they were trying to rattle me, and it was working. By morning, the noises stopped. I packed up everything as fast as I could, stuffed it all into the car, and was ready to leave when I noticed something on the back wall of the cabin. Scratched into the wood, long, deep lines, was a word. Stay. That was it. No signature, no other marks, just that single word carved deep like they had all night to do it. I drove out of there faster than I should have, bouncing over the gravel road, branches scraping the side of my car. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near Asheville, where I sat in the parking lot for an hour, just trying to breathe. I called the couple who owned the cabin from a payphone, told them someone had been watching the place, maybe living nearby. They didn't seem surprised, just said they'd take a look when they got a chance. That was it. I never went back. That weekend was supposed to be quiet, a break. But what I realized is that isolation isn't always peaceful. Sometimes, being truly alone means no one's coming if something goes wrong. And whoever was in those woods, they weren't passing through. They were waiting. Back in Charlotte, I installed cameras around my apartment. I double-checked the locks every night. I still wake up sometimes, thinking I hear someone outside. And I never go anywhere without telling at least 2 people where I'll be. That trip changed something in me. And the worst part? That last morning, as I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror one final time. Toby was staring out the back window, quietly growling. It was early October of 2017 when I decided to take some time off from everything. I was 32, living in St. Paul, Minnesota, working in property management, and I'd been getting chewed up by stress for months. Emails, phone calls, complaints. It felt like every hour of my day was claimed by someone else. I needed silence. I needed to hear myself think again. I hadn't slept right in weeks. When I finally burned through the last of my patience and sent a resignation email one Friday night, I packed a few things and got out the next morning. I remembered a small, off-grid cabin that my uncle had owned near Deadfall Ridge in northern Wisconsin. He'd passed away a few years earlier, and no one had touched the place since. I still had the key on an old ring. It wasn't far, maybe a 4-hour drive northeast. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't want anyone knowing. I just needed to vanish for a while, away from lights, noise, everything. I loaded up my Subaru with a cooler, camping stove, canned food, extra water, a first aid kit, some books, and a sleeping bag. I took a small Ruger .22 rifle just for peace of mind, mostly for critters, I figured. The cell signal would be non-existent up there, so I downloaded some offline maps and a GPS backup. The plan was simple. Go up, spend a week in total silence, reset my brain, then come back to the world. The road narrowed the further I went. Asphalt turned to gravel, gravel turned to dirt, and eventually even that gave out. The trail was overgrown, but I remembered just enough to keep going. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled up beside the cabin. The place looked worse than I remembered. Moss was creeping up the sides, and one of the shutters was hanging half off. Still, the roof looked intact, and the door was still locked. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood. There were cobwebs in the corners and mouse droppings near the sink, but nothing too wild. The water pump was bone dry, which I expected, and the fireplace had old ash in it. I cracked a few windows and let the air settle. It took a few hours to clean the place up enough to feel livable, but by the time the sun dipped low, I had a small fire going, a can of chili heating on my little stove, and a cot set up in the corner with my sleeping bag. That first night was quiet, dead quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I kept expecting to hear a plane or a car or even some distant dogs barking, but there was nothing. just the occasional wind dragging across the roof or the snap of a twig outside. By the third day, I'd settled into a rhythm. Wake up with the sun, boil some instant coffee, sit on the front steps and listen to the forest. Sometimes I read. Other times I'd just walk a trail for hours, following deer paths and old game trails through the woods. I didn't see anyone. No hunters, no hikers, no campers. Not even a hint of another soul. That suited me fine. On the fourth day, something changed. I woke up feeling stiff and cold. It had dipped below freezing overnight, and I hadn't stoked the fireplace before falling asleep. I pulled on a heavier hoodie and went to start a fire, but I noticed the woodpile looked different. Some of the pieces I'd stacked were moved, just slightly off. I thought maybe an animal had tried to dig around. A raccoon or porcupine, maybe. I brushed it off, got the fire going, and went about my morning. Later that afternoon, I went deeper into the woods than usual. I followed a dry creek I hadn't seen before, and it led to an old hunting blind about 2 miles out. It was just a platform nailed between two trees, rotted and leaning. I climbed up out of curiosity and found a rusted coffee can with old cigarette butts inside. I figured it hadn't been used in years. When I got back to the cabin around sunset, I found the front door cracked open. I froze. My heart kicked into overdrive. I was sure I'd locked it. I always did. My hand went straight to the rifle slung over my back. I didn't go inside right away. I stood in the clearing, listening. Nothing moved. The trees swayed a little in the wind, but there was no sound from the cabin. After a few minutes, I crept up, stepped to the side of the door, and nudged it open with the barrel of the rifle. Inside looked normal at first. Nothing obviously missing or trashed. But as I walked in slowly, I saw that the cooler had been opened. 2 cans were gone, one of chili and one of peaches. The bag with my matches was half dumped out. My sleeping bag had fresh dirt on it. I didn't know what to do. I checked around the cabin, but there was no one inside. I looked for tracks around the property, but the ground was hard and covered in dry leaves. Nothing clear. There was no forced entry, just an unlocked door. That night, I barely slept. I kept the rifle beside me, and every sound outside made me sit up and listen. At some point near 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. Slow, steady crunching in the leaves. I didn't move. I barely breathed. They passed the front porch, circled to the back, then faded. The next morning, I considered leaving, but I told myself maybe it was a drifter or an animal. Someone might have just stumbled onto the place, looking for food or shelter. That happens, right? Still, I packed everything up tight and carried the rifle with me all day, even inside. On day 5, I didn't go far from the cabin. I chopped more wood, boiled extra water, and stayed alert. Around noon, I found a cigarette but near the edge of the clearing. Still fresh, not even wet from the dew. I don't smoke. It hadn't been there before. That's when I knew someone was around. I made the choice to sleep during the day and stay up at night. That night, I sat in the dark with the fire out, wrapped in blankets, rifle in hand, and waited. Around 1:30 a.m., I saw movement near the treeline. Just a shape at first, then 2 people. They were crouched low, maybe 20 yards out, half hidden behind brush. They were watching the cabin. I felt paralyzed. I didn't know what they wanted, if they were armed, if they were just some crazy off-grid types, or worse. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I sat there in total darkness for hours, heart hammering, just watching back. At some point, they vanished. I didn't hear them go, just blinked and they were gone. The next morning, I walked to where they'd been. I found prints, deep ones. 2 people, maybe 3. One wore boots. Another had lighter shoes, maybe sneakers. No gear, no trash, just tracks. I left that afternoon. I didn't pack carefully. I just shoved everything into the back of the Subaru, kept the rifle across my lap, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit a town with cell service. I called the county sheriff's office and gave them the coordinates. I didn't want to go back even with police. They found signs of a camp not far from the cabin. Tarp lean-tos, burned cans, and a few stolen items. They told me it looked like transients. Probably 2 men and maybe a younger person. No names, no arrests. They'd already moved on. I went back to St. Paul. I didn't tell anyone much about it. I sold the cabin to a logger that winter for almost nothing. I've never gone back to the woods since. I still think about those nights, the way they watched from the trees, waiting, not saying anything, just watching. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some haunted thing. It was real people, and somehow that's a whole lot worse. My name's Eric. I'm 34 years old, and this happened back in late October 2019. At the time, I was working as a freelance graphic designer, mostly staying home and handling everything online. That kind of freedom let me get away from the city sometimes, especially when things got overwhelming. I'd just come off a string of tight deadline projects, barely sleeping or eating properly, and my head felt like it was full of static. I needed out. So, I rented a cabin in upstate Maine through a small site that specialized in off-grid getaways. It wasn't some luxury Airbnb cabin with Wi-Fi and fancy appliances. It was real old school. Wood stove for heat, no electricity, no plumbing beyond a basic pump for cold water. One room, a small kitchen area, and a loft bed. The place sat near the edge of a forest preserve, with no other homes or cabins for at least 5 or 6 miles. It was exactly what I needed. At least that's what I thought going in. I drove up early in the morning from Boston. The last stretch of the road was narrow and unpaved, more of a gravel trail cutting through thick woods than anything else. The trees were mostly bare, just clinging to a few orange and yellow leaves. It had rained the day before, so the dirt road was slick and soft in places. My little SUV wasn't exactly built for that, but I managed. When I got there, I found the cabin just like the owner had described. Tiny, grayish-brown, built low to the ground, and tucked into a slight clearing that opened up into dense woods. The driveway just kind of ended at the edge of a sloped patch of land where the cabin sat. There was a narrow path off to the right, barely wide enough to walk through, that looked like it led deeper into the forest. I made a mental note to avoid that. Hiking alone out here wasn't the smartest idea. I got the key from under a loose rock near the front door, opened up, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dry wood and dust. It wasn't dirty, just old. The kind of old where the floorboards creak no matter where you step, and the windows rattle if there's even a light breeze. The place had a sort of rustic charm, and after unloading my bags and lighting a fire in the stove, I felt myself start to relax for the first time in weeks. The first couple of days were uneventful. I'd wake up with the sun, make coffee on the propane burner, and spend hours sitting on the small porch with a blanket over my legs, watching the wind move through the trees. No phone signal, no distractions, just the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the occasional creaking of trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I welcomed it. It was on the 4th day that things started to feel off. I woke up around 6 a.m., just before dawn. The air inside the cabin was freezing, so I got the fire going right away. While I waited for the place to warm up, I stepped outside to take a leak. It had rained again during the night, and everything was damp. The sky was overcast, casting a grayish light over everything. I noticed something strange as I stood on the porch. There were footprints in the mud. Not mine, they were too big and had a different tread pattern than my hiking boots. They came from the direction of the narrow trail, stopped about 10 feet from my porch, then turned and went back the way they came. I stood there for a long time just staring. The tracks weren't fresh, maybe a few hours old at most, but still, someone had walked right up to my cabin in the middle of the night and left without knocking or announcing themselves. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hunter got turned around? Maybe someone from the preserve came out to check the area? But there was no reason to come that close and then leave without making contact. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping busy. I read, jotted some notes in my journal, and made simple meals. But I kept checking the window, glancing toward that trail. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to some creak or soft thump outside. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard crunching, like someone walking slowly across wet leaves. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and held my breath. The sound didn't come again, but I stayed awake until the sun came up, just listening. The next morning, I went outside and scanned the area around the cabin. I didn't see anything at first, but when I walked around the back, I found more footprints. Same size, same tread. They circled behind the cabin and stopped about 5 feet from the back wall, then disappeared into the trees. That's when I decided I needed to get out of there. Maybe not that second, but soon. I didn't want to wait until something worse happened. I packed up most of my stuff, loaded the car, and planned to leave the next morning. I'd already paid for the full week, but I didn't care anymore. That night, I kept the fire low so the light wouldn't be visible from outside. I sat in the dark, wide awake, holding the small hatchet the owner had left next to the woodpile. Around 3:30 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. Not fast, not loud, just slow, deliberate steps on wet ground. I turned off the small battery lantern I had on and moved to the window. I couldn't see much through the glass, just the outline of trees and darkness beyond them. But then something moved. A figure, just barely visible. They were standing a few feet from the tree line, not moving, just watching the cabin. My stomach dropped. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark shape. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stood there, staring through the glass, waiting for them to do something. But they didn't. After what felt like forever, they turned and walked back into the woods. I waited until daylight before I moved. I grabbed my last few things, tossed them into the car, and got out of there. The trail out was even more of a mess after the rain, and I nearly got stuck twice, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to a place with people. On the way out, I stopped at a small gas station about 20 miles from the cabin. The guy behind the counter looked like he'd been working there his whole life. I asked him casually if there were a lot of hunters in the area. He gave me a strange look and said hunting wasn't allowed anywhere near that stretch of woods. It was a protected zone. I asked if anyone else lived nearby, or if there were rangers or staff who might check on the place. He shook his head and told me the preserve didn't really get visitors. Too remote, he said. Too much wildlife, not enough trails. Most people avoided it. I didn't tell him about the footprints or the figure in the woods. I just nodded, paid for gas, and drove home. It's been years now, and I haven't been back to Maine since. I still don't know who or what that person was. Maybe some drifter living off the grid. Maybe someone hiding out. Or maybe just some local messing with me. I'll never know. But one thing still bothers me. I didn't notice it at first, not until a few weeks later when I was going through the photos I'd taken at the cabin. I'd snapped a picture of the porch on the second day, the morning after I arrived. Just a casual shot of the trees and the path leading off into the woods. When I zoomed in, way in the background, almost hidden behind a tree, was a figure, standing still, watching,